And Jess Allard says her son is a music tech major. Jess, I will get his number and see if you'd like to make us a theme song.
I feel like for this year, I don't know if it would be the Brady Bunch or Hollywood Squares, if anyone remembers Hollywood Squares. Good.
Love Hollywood Squares.
NaRCAD.
I don't know why they don't still have that program. They really should. All right, well, we're just at about 100 folks. I know people are going to, I see you, Brenda Schuster. I believe what we'll do is take off now that we're at 100. And as folks trickle in, they can catch on up, especially as the first couple of moments will be a refresher and a welcome. So without further ado, welcome to day 3. We're really, really excited. I know I've been probably saying we're excited multiple times across the past 3 days, just because it's true. And the past 2 days have been supremely energizing for all of us here at NaRCAD, and hopefully for all of you as well. For those of you who missed any of yesterday, some of the highlights, and certainly not everything that was discussed, but some highlights, we're really looking at COVID-19's impact on detailing and facing forward to the ways that we as a community can try and support frontline clinicians in navigating the slew of never-ending information about COVID coming out on the daily and seemingly changing quite often. Also looking into e-detailing, which of course is a theme across all 3 days and will be probably the central theme for the foreseeable future. Really excited to continue our community of practice, and we'll tell you a bit more about that later on today. We had people reflecting on inevitable glitches and challenges, but also really leading the way on our e-detailing panel, focusing on staying positive and acknowledging, as I believe Jackie Myers said, we're in a weird space. It's weird. I think the acknowledgement and the validation is really key right now. We're not supposed to know exactly what we're doing, but we're getting closer together. Also really focused on the magnificent impact of deploying students into the field, training students, really finding ways for that new energy and that excitement to be woven into really critical academic detailing interventions, and learning from those students and their unique perspectives, as well as spending some time looking at the key role of pharmacy in combating the opioid crisis. We also wrapped up yesterday talking about pivoting to our approach to detailing on type 2 diabetes with our friends at Alosa Health. And part of what they focused on was detailing in ACOs as well as community health centers. And whether you're working on diabetes or chronic disease or not, a lot of great areas of focus on the specific types of challenges that vulnerable patients who try to access healthcare through community health centers are faced with, and ways that folks who are in detailing and really want to support those clinicians with supporting in turn those particularly vulnerable patients can have an impact in terms of creating new materials and finding ways to overcome challenges. All right, that was quick and dirty. If you want to learn more and you missed anything, it'll be up on the website shortly under our Conference Hub archives. Happy Wednesday from all of us. For those of you who've been spending the past 2 days with us, you're probably sick of us, but either way, we're still going to say hi. Those of you who know me, good morning. Those of you who do not, and thank you for nodding your head no, Zach, that you're not sick of us. Those of you who know me, I'm Bevan Shigori, the Communications and Education Director here at NaRCAD. Really happy to be emceeing today, and I will turn it over to our Director, Mike Fisher, to say good morning.
Good morning. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for sticking with us through 3 days, and not just sticking with us, but making it fun and exciting, and taking our apprehension last week about what a virtual conference could be and turning it into excitement at what a great and engaged community we have.
Thanks, Mike. And over to Jerry, our co-director.
Great to see everybody back again for another day. I've been just delighted at how well things have been going. I've been learning a lot, and I hope you have as well. And again, all credit to the NaRCAD team for pulling this off so seamlessly, almost perfectly, given the constraints. So thank you all for being here. It's going to be another great day, and I'm glad we're all together.
Thanks, Jerry. Anna, our program manager, will say hello, and she is one of the amazing folks behind the scenes who is making all of our polls run beautifully, making sure that all of the presenters are ready to rock, and just generally making the rest of us look fantastic. Anna.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 3.
All right, I'm going to pass the mic to our awesome program coordinator, Winnie Ho, who puts together so much of the content on our website and is also providing some tech support today and making sure all of the resources in our chat box are together, making sure you have what you need and curating those resources for all of you at the end of today. Winnie, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Looking forward to day 3 with all of you.
And last but certainly not least is our pal Subeen Lee. She is a research assistant at the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology, under which NaRCAD is housed, and she has been phenomenal at applying her skills to support us with tech and general events assistance. Good morning, Subeen.
Good morning, everyone.
All right, so if you can't find us, just look for the turquoise background when possible, or for the word NaRCAD after our names. We are happy to help. Quick reminders on housekeeping and tips. Make sure your video is on if you can. If you didn't consent to having your video on our recordings, no problem. Just keep your video off. We will have everyone muted during presentations. You can either use the raise hand function, but what's more direct is to go and pop over to the chat box, put your question in, and we will either unmute you for more information that you'd like to share and context, or let you continue to write your thoughts in the chat box. Totally up to you. So use that chat box to ask questions, and make sure you set your questions or comments to everyone. We'll show you how in just a second. We will respond to your questions during designated Q&A segments. And unfortunately, I've said this at the beginning of every day that we won't get to everyone's questions, but I'm proud to say we have so far, not to jinx us. So let's see what happens today. But just in case we don't, we do have our fantastic discussion forum built from scratch by Winnie Ho, so that you can continue that conversation. Quick reminder, if you have patient stories, please anonymize. And again, if you have tech issues, please reach out to Winnie, Subeen, or Anna on a direct private chat. All right. When we have a discussion, a segment that's designated, you'll see a slide that looks like this, and then we'll pull out to the rest of the group, freeze the slideshow so you can all see each other's beautiful faces. You're going to want to adjust to speaker view to see who's speaking, since there are 150 people and growing on the call at the moment. How you'll do that is drop down from view options. You'll click exit full screen, and then over on the right, you'll see speaker view, which you can click. To make sure your chat box is set to everyone, go to the bottom right and use the drop down. If you want to send something private to someone else, you can look them up by typing their name or scrolling alphabetically. As always, this is an ASZ, acronym-free zone. Please, let's do our best to make sure that we spell out whatever it is we are using as an acronym the first time we use it. And if you'd like to follow along in more detail, one of the bummers about this year is we don't have our usual awesome printed program book tangibly in your hands, but it is still as fantastic as ever with special curated blog articles, really interesting stuff. Do take a peek at that. And check us out at NaRCAD.org/2020 program. All right, today we've got some really great stuff. I'm supremely excited for our next session, which is an expert panel about strong clinician relationships. We're going to go at it Oprah style and see what happens. I certainly won't be able to rise to the challenge of meeting Oprah, but I'll do my best, except none of you are going to walk away with cars. After that, we'll have a lunch break and then a special presentation on HIV prevention and treatment. We'll have field presentations featuring global perspectives on AD from folks that we really respect across the globe, from Australia, Canada, and Norway. And then after our afternoon break, we will wrap up with a new feature that we've created this year called the 2020 Yearbook. It's for folks who have relatively new programs who will be talking about the ways that they kicked off and what they've learned so far. We encourage you to stick around as long as you can. We'll probably end a few minutes early, but would really love to show you what we've got up our sleeve for next year. All right, so now to the fun stuff. For those of you who've been polling everywhere with us, you know how to do this, and for those of you who are new, just follow the directions on the screen. Pop a text to the number 22333 with the word NaRCAD 1108. if you were set up to do this yesterday, you may need to re-log on just because Pull Everywhere, like every online platform, likes to be a little glitchy and throw us curveballs from time to time. Once you've joined, you will see that your text message that will come in from Pull Everywhere will say, you have joined NaRCAD's conference session. All right, so let's kick off in just a moment while you all get settled. We're gonna ask you a question that steps back from any specific clinical content-based intervention and think more broadly, why are we in this field? What are we trying to do in terms of relationship building, behavior change, and building that focus on trust and reliability as part of the service that we all provide as detailers. So with that in mind, go ahead and text text a response to this question. When a detailer and clinician start a one-to-one session, how might the clinician feel? Pick a word or a phrase. Why me? Thanks to whoever said that. Annoyed, apprehensive, skeptical, defensive, unsure. Oh boy, I hope there's a positive one in there somewhere. Tired, yes. Worried, crunched for time, irritated, self-conscious, suspicious. Oh boy, interested. Thank you, whoever put that, and also put an exclamation after it. Few more, uncertain, yep, excited, we hope. I'm sure there are folks out there who are excited. All right, we're seeing a lot of the same trends, which just lets you all know, which you probably knew already, your job is hard. You're going in there facing a person who has feelings, stresses, and responsibilities. And let's end with curious. We hope that everyone is curious when a detailer walks in the door. All right, let's flip the script. When the session starts, how might the detailer feel? Excited, nervous. Oh, wow. Yes, anxious, scared, LOL, yes. Scared and hopefully laughing out loud at the end in a good way. Apprehensive, lots of nervouses. Yep, pumped, high energy. All right, we hope. Got a lot of good stuff here. Confident. Let's end with that. We hope that you're all feeling confident when you go in, but you don't need to be every day, as long as you crammed to the gills with data. Yes, as long as you are bringing the best self that you can. All right. So thanks for kicking us off and helping us think creatively about this. It's no surprise that so many of you had the same answers, meaning that we are very much on the same page. And again, no surprise there. But what we'll do next is we're going to kick off what, again, I am just delighted to say is going to be a really cool session and very different than our usual sessions. And so the ways in which it'll be different, again, talking about the Oprah approach, is I'm going to introduce three fantastic detailers and then back out so you can all, as audience members, see one another. All right. So without further ado, I would love to introduce our first panelist, Jackie Travers. She's a clinical academic detailing pharmacist out of Oklahoma City, and she has been doing detailing for over 5 years. She serves as the chair of the AD committee down there, and she does a lot of work with academic detailing as a part of service to Oklahoma Medicaid. She participates in developing the detailing materials, delivering the services, analyzing the results. She pretty much does it all, but also with the awesome co-team member of hers, Reagan Smith, and many more other fantastic colleagues down there. Some of her areas of focus in her AD program have been pediatric antipsychotics, pediatric ADHD, pediatric vaccinations, antibiotic stewardship related to upper respiratory infections, and beyond. So we're really, really delighted to have Jackie here with us today. Welcome, Jackie.
Thank you.
Next we have Mary Liz Doyle-Taduni. Oh boy, we really like all three of you ladies. And Mary Liz, I've been delighted to be able to work with. Both she and Jackie are training facilitator experts for our NaRCAD team, which is an extra bonus for us. Mary Liz is an academic detailer for IDIS, the Independent Drug Information Service, and also an expert training consultant. She works for Alosa Health as well as with NaRCAD. She works out of Philadelphia, and is an educational specialist with a PhD, MBA, MSN, and RN. So she's got a lot to share. Some of the areas of focus that she has worked on related to academic detailing for over 15 years now is focusing on the elderly population, specifically falls prevention, elder abuse, COPD, diabetes, chronic disease, atrial fibrillation. So a lot of great ideas and tips to share. Thanks for being here, Mary Liz. And last but not least, Jess Allward is one of my favorite new people. So delighted to get to know her. She is out of New Hampshire, works out of Concord, and is a trainer for the state in diversity and cultural competency. Prior to her current role as a public health education and detailing specialist, she was also an ed and training coordinator for the Bureau of Infectious Disease Control and Prevention up in New Hampshire. She provides ed resources and technical assistance to New Hampshire providers, community partners, and residents. So she does it all, wears many hats. And she's relatively new to the field. She'd never know it because she's such a pro. She's been spending the past year working on HIV prevention academic detailing and also looking at, similarly to our breakout session on Monday, impact by using social media and apps to provide resources and discussion over to the providers that she works with. She's also starting to work on COVID, expedited partner therapy, and focusing primarily on HIV PrEP prescribing. All right, welcome ladies. It is wonderful to see you all. And what I'm going to do now, as promised, is back on out of here and make sure we can see everyone. All right, good morning. So I want to give you all a chance for folks to hear your voices. Jackie, if you'd like to say a quick hello.
Hello from Oklahoma City. Good to see everyone.
Thanks, Jackie. Over to you, Mary Liz.
Hi, everybody from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
And Jess.
Good morning, everyone. I'm here in Laconia, New Hampshire, where we had a little snow last night.
Thanks so much, Jess. It's really nice to have all three of you here for multiple reasons. I think sometimes what we want to make sure we do is feel that the work that we're all doing is accessible, that there's not a hard line between folks who are coming in new and then folks who've been doing this for many, many, many years. I think bridging that gap is looking at, no matter how long you've been doing this, there are so many nuggets of expertise to share. And so, we're excited to look at the cross-section, the diverse cross-section here of experience you've all had, where you hail from in the States, what patient population you work with, and also the clinical topics, super diverse. As we go, this is going to be a different kind of session where if questions come up, I will do my best to try to throw them over to these lovely ladies as we go. So don't hesitate to go ahead, audience members, and put your questions right in the chat box, and I will do my best to get to all of them. But the first thing I'm going to do is ask each of these ladies to talk a little bit about what it's like building relationships when you were brand new to this. And just since you are the freshest face in the field, would love to say, what has it been like this past year being brand new? What have been some of the first things you felt that you would love to tell yourself a year ago to keep an eye out for?
Yeah. Well, the program here was originally set up back in 2014. And then because of staffing, we had a little lull and we kind of reinvigorated the program about 2 years ago. The first year or so was just like materials development, getting a plan, doing some research, gathering data, all of that kind of stuff. And then we actually got out into the field and I was so excited to get in that first door. I couldn't wait to actually start practicing what I learned at NaRCAD and use all the materials. And then it became very real, actually getting a foot in the door was super tough. Getting past the gatekeepers was a challenge. Making good first impressions seemed to really matter. And what I learned was that you really have to have a lot of patience. You have to give providers a chance to get to know you and the resources that you can provide for them. And when I did finally get in the door the first few times, I realized that what I thought was going to be all about me and my presentation was really not. It was more about their practice and the provider and all of the questions that they had and just really starting to make those those bonds, not with just doctors and nurse practitioners, but with everybody in the practice.
Awesome. Thanks, Jess. And I think patients really being key. One of our favorite people, Amanda Kennedy from Vermont, always says that it's a marathon, not a sprint, right? So making sure that you are putting down those bricks slowly to build the relationship. I'm going to turn it over to Jackie to share with us. Tell us where you were at when you were first trained and sort of some of the things that you felt when you first got into the field. And, you know, thinking from the perspective of all of those folks in the audience who are just getting started and might be feeling, in general, some of those feelings that came up on the poll everywhere: nervous, excited, scared. Jackie, what can you share in terms of tips, and tell us a little bit about what it was like for you as you got settled in the field?
Sure. So when I first was thinking about scheduling the first visit, honestly, I felt really, really prepared. I'd done the training, I'd read all the literature, I was involved in the material preparation, so I just really felt like I knew my stuff. And then the first detailing visit was scheduled, and I was in my car, and I was driving 3 hours, and that was a panic-filled 3 hours, and I just thought, oh my gosh, they're not gonna listen to me, they're not gonna care, they're gonna be too busy, nobody's gonna who is this person, what are they gonna, they're just gonna kick me out. And then I got there, and fear quickly gave way to optimism because they were lovely and they were friendly and they were welcoming, and providers need resources just like anybody else. And so there's trepidation and there's anxiousness, and all of that is real, and it's important to know that you're going to feel that way, but also to know that it very, very quickly subsides and gives way to this shared experience where you're both just thinking about ways you can help make patients' lives better, and where can you implement the evidence, and what tools can you bring to the table, and how can you partner together on this journey. I really liked the analogy of the online detailing being like a blind date, but the in-person detailing also feels very much like a blind date. You know a little bit about them, they may know a little bit about you. It ends with a very hopeful situation, I would say probably 95 times out of 100.
That's lovely and super positive for those folks who are nervous about wanting to have a perfect batting average. I'll turn it over to Mary Liz, who has so much fantastic experience, has worked with so many different clinicians, that when she does our training sessions and has to take on different personalities, oh boy, does she have a lot of different ones to pick from, and some of them are quite scary. So Mary Liz, talk to us realistically about what it's been like for you, what you remember about when you started out, and what are some key tips you would tell the newbies here, and also the folks who've been doing it for a little while who are still feeling that trepidation from time to time. And I know Jackie said 95% of the time is you know, really a positive way to look at it. I know that you have also shared that the goal isn't always to get that key message commitment, but that it's really just to go in and show up as a first sort of starting point. So talk to us about whatever comes to mind when thinking about these different areas and starting out.
Oh, sure. Wow. So full evolution and full circle, I could say, is the way things have gone. Okay. So I've been doing this for about 15 years now. And Jerry, I see you're on as well. So you've heard some of my stories through the years. And also I see some of you who I've trained in NaRCAD on the call too. So hopefully it wasn't too scary. But anyway, just to put it very bluntly, I think you have to be resilient, being an academic detailer. When I started 15 years ago, it's been a real evolution of healthcare. If you look at healthcare and what's happened in 15 years has changed a lot with academic detailing. And I'm sure Jerry could comment from way back in the 80s as well. But even the past 15 years, the scope of practice has changed. So when I first started, detailing is purely with physicians, and now it's evolved into nurse practitioners, PAs, which involves a whole different scope of models, right? You have the PA model, you've got the physician model, the nurse practitioner model. So with that really involves different relationships and really catering to their needs as well, and how they've learned as well. So over time, it's that resilience and persistence with just overall, just, you know, tending to the needs. That needs assessment is so important, and getting to know that practitioner is so, so important. And that will really build your trust over time. I could go on, but Bevan, I'll stop now.
I know that there's just so many things to say that we can't possibly tear down to 75 minutes. So, and I know that these three lovely ladies have shared that they, would be amenable to chatting further offline, and you can always all ask us to triage questions to them. But let's keep going. So I'm going to throw it the other way, because all three of you have painted such a mostly optimistic picture of how things can go and how to build those relationships. Can you talk to us about a time that was really uncomfortable for you, where you felt that your impact might have been less than you had hoped for, or a time when you were so challenged to connect with a new clinician that you met that you really had to try to find a totally different way to approach the situation? Jackie, can we start with you to just kind of talk to us, because I know that you've met with so many different folks, and if there's anything specific to the patient populations and the intervention you were working on, feel free to share that as well.
Sure. So I would say probably one of my most challenging detailing sessions was a rural provider, and we were talking about ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, in the pediatric space. And I walked into his office, and he had a pile of papers, and he slammed them on the desk and said, "I know all this. What are you here for? I don't have time for this." Almost literally word for word. And so I was, not surprisingly, quite taken aback. And so I just kind of thought back to my training and did a real quick pivot and said, "So what I'm hearing is that you feel very confident in your assessment of this disease state. Why don't you tell me how you tend to treat patients?" All the wind went right out of those sails. And so what was a very defensive position became a very sharing position. It was
That's
very
fantastic.
helpful, very challenging. Yeah.
And yet you handled it really leaning into your instincts. And I think what we've sort of talked about a lot, especially during our trainings here at NaRCAD, is oftentimes that defensiveness is fairly easy to just poke and have it fall over, right? It's a defensiveness that is protective of time, protective of a feeling of expertise, that sort of, I don't have time for this, and also, who are you to come in here and tell me what to do? And so, Jackie, what I love about what you just shared is you sort of flipped and said, yes, it sounds like you are an expert. Can you tell me about your expertise? As Mike always says at our training, clinicians often, and most people do, like to talk about themselves. So if you are able to say, I want to hear more, or sometimes even taking it to that next level of, oh, that's great, I'm going to be visiting more clinicians who don't feel as confident as you. What would you tell them? So really great way to disarm. I'm going to throw it to Jess and say, Jess, in your first year, and I know that you've been working so much on HIV, what kind of challenges have come up for you? And I'm wondering if any of them have to do with the content, especially because, we know in working with HIV PrEP interventions across the states that oftentimes clinicians are uncomfortable talking about sexual health. So this might not be something that came up for you, but if it did, would love to hear about it, or any other challenges that you've had.
Sure. So one of the things that often comes up when you're talking about HIV, PrEP, and PEP is stigma. And that's one of the things that we see from a lot of different topics that we detail about. And it kind of goes both ways, in that the provider feels like they're walking a very thin line about what they can ask their patients, how do they ask their patients, and patients feel very stigmatized about some of the things that they are being asked. So as a detailer, what you like to do is recognize that right up front, that it's not something that just this provider necessarily feels, or just that their patient feels, that it's a very common thing. And that to be a really good caregiver, we have to be willing to put ourselves at risk and kind of get out there and have some uncomfortable conversations, both detailer to provider and provider to patient. So trying to make sure that you have a good relationship with your provider already established, and some trust there about these kind of conversations before you ever get to the actual topic is really super important. So going back to what Jackie said, recognize that they're busy, recognize that they think they have a really good handle on their patients and their practice and what they're doing, and validate that for them and build that trust. Let them know that you're here to be a support for them and a resource, and just really make sure that they're comfortable talking with you before you move on to the difficult topics.
I love that so much, Jess. You know, I think many of us in detailing feel that, you know, we're not necessarily doing it right if we walk in and are met with some of that pushback, that stigma, and feeling as though, oh, well, I don't want to tell a clinician that they're using stigmatizing language. And I think what you talked about there in terms of having mutual respect and recognizing that it's about having a conversation versus going in and telling somebody what to do, going in and being punitive, going in and saying that's the wrong way to look at it. It's not black and white. Going in and getting a sense of where that person is at by doing great needs assessment is really at the core of what academic detailing is all about. And so, Mary Liz, I'd love to throw that to you. I know you really focus on empathy and looking at validating where a clinician is at. When you first start putting yourself in the shoes of a provider when you walk in or you do an e-detailing visit, what's sort of the first thing you do to try to understand what's important to them? It could be either certain questions you always ask, regardless of the clinical topic, or just other ways you try to find out where is that clinician at. Curious about any tips there.
No, it's a great question, Bevan. And that is, I would just say, I'm not a salesperson. So I always want to go to how they're doing that day. I want to be genuine. That's how I feel like I am as a person. And I truly do want to know how they are. So that will like guide me with the whole conversation from that way, because I could see if they're having a bad day, good day, how much time they have, like things like that. And also just to really see what happened from the last visit I was there. So it's kind of like a good way to just kind of introduce myself again that day and just to kind of see where they're coming from as well. And
excellent.
Yeah, and every physician, NP and PA are different. And, you know, you may have some really great encounters and some bad encounters. And the good ones will always stick with you as well as the bad ones. So, you know, hopefully the bad ones won't be as many, so.
Thanks, Mary Liz. And I think one thing to kind of help arm those of you who are so nervous and excited and kind of anxious about having a challenging face-to-face encounter or e-detailing encounter is to expect the challenge, right? So for me, I don't get upset when I get a parking ticket in Boston because I know that having a car in Boston, that it's sort of a tax that comes with it. It's inevitable that you're going to get that parking ticket. It's inevitable that over these past 3 days, we've had tech glitches. And so I think going and knowing realistically, you're dealing with human beings here. As Mary Liz said, figuring out what kind of moods they're in, how has their day been, and recognizing that everyone is different. I think in some instances, we all carry a bit of stigma and stereotypes, even if we try to sort of flush those and meet people where they're at, where based on our own experiences, we may think, oh, you know, general internists tend to be like this. You know, pharmacists tend to be like this. And I think we have to kind of stop ourselves short and say, let's use some person-first language here. This is a person who's doing the best that they can. And so I love what you had to say about that, Mary Liz. Thanks for sharing that. I'd love to talk a little bit more about the meat of the visit. So let's say you've gotten in that door, you're doing your needs assessment, and whether the person has started out with open arms, curiosity, or defensiveness, you've gotten past that initial, over that initial hump. When you are building that relationship in the middle of the session, how do you maintain that empathy and understanding if a clinician's views are so wildly different from yours or from the evidence or from the key messages? Do you ever get to a point where you feel like it's necessary to throw in the towel, or do you keep trying to find a new way to approach this? And Jackie, I'm going to throw that to you to start us off.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think this is a really critical piece because inevitably you will eventually come up against something like that. They're just going to have different opinions. One thing that has helped me is to understand that however they came to this position, it's because of an experience that they've had. And so an example that comes to mind is I had a provider who always gave all pediatric patients with an ear infection an antibiotic. Definitely not in keeping with the evidence. And so part of our conversation was, how did you come to this decision? And he revealed to me that during his training, It was in a very different situation and very large health inequities and health disparities and things like that. And he saw a lot of children who had had untreated ear infections and lost their hearing as a result of it. And so it was a very dramatic thing for him to experience, and it was very formative in his training. And so to ask him to move from all antibiotics to a very, very limited batch of antibiotics wasn't a place that he was comfortable with. But he was comfortable moving from from ceftonir to amoxicillin, which was a much more evidence-based approach. And then he was also open to having a follow-up call with parents about side effects, diarrhea, nausea, things like that. And so to let him move in the increments that he was able and willing to do was just so very important when we started at vastly different perspectives in where the evidence was guiding and what the appropriate set of actions was.
That's such a great story that really illustrates that so beautifully, that, you know, folks do come in not just with wanting to provide care to their patients using the best evidence, but also looking at what they've seen. And it sounds like what's impacted them can be sometimes even more informative of their approach, informs their approach even more. You know, when you hear about somebody who says, I've had children go deaf because of this, it's going to be hard to kind of figure out how to meet them where they're at. And it sounds like really breaking it down into smaller steps, and instead of focusing on one massive behavior change, finding the smaller ways, and also looking at what other supports are available, looking at communicating not just with patients, but their families, especially when you have pediatrics, which is of course key. So I really, really love that. I'd love to turn it over to Jess and just ask her too, if there have been moments where the evidence has been something that clinicians who you're speaking with about sexual health seems to be something that they can't wrap their heads around.
Sure. I think the important thing in this conversation is to remember that empathy is very different from agreement. We can empathize with an opinion or a point of view or a stance that a provider or anybody in our life takes on something without necessarily agreeing with them. And in the world today, it doesn't seem like we can agree to disagree civilly, but we really can. And as detailers, that's part of our job too, is to really try to find out and understand why they hold certain beliefs to be true or best, and be respectful of how they form them. Just like Jackie said, he came to that decision through some really tough experiences that he has. And it's the same with sexual health. People come to the thought processes they have about how best to talk to patients about their sexual health or treat sexual health through their past experiences as well. NaRCAD likes to tell us to say things like, tell us some more about that, or how did you get to that opinion? And that's what I like to do as a detailer, is just really do that back and forth conversation with them about why they feel that that may not be best practice or what they hold to be best practice, and then ask them to make tiny little baby steps over a course of a bunch of visits toward moving toward what actually is best practice.
Love that. And that should be such a nugget there, is such a nugget that we can all remember, is empathy is different from agreement. Yes, I love that. I love that. Want to move back to Mary Liz and grab something that she said a moment ago. She said, I'm not a salesperson. I think it's very rare that folks who become academic detailers come from a sales background, although it's not unheard of, especially folks who have moved away from pharma sales. One question we get so often from folks who are trying this, who are very well trained in motivational interviewing, is that they say, I'm with it until I get to the end. I just don't want to feel like a sleazy car salesman. The whole sales thing doesn't make me feel good. And a lot of what we talk about is you're not selling something to somebody that they don't want. You're trying to come to an agreement about moving forward with a specific practice or behavior change. With that said, I want to ask you all, what is it about that closing that makes it feel a little more accessible? Because I know a lot of folks get all the way to the closing and say, whew, I didn't get thrown out, I'm good. I'm going to quit while I'm ahead. And that's the piece where we really, really need to hit it out of the park the most. So I'm going to ask Jess to kick us off and just say, how do you do a closing, and do you ever feel nervous about that when you're making a very concrete ask?
So, you know, Bevan, I'm from a theater background, so I'm kind of goofy and go with the flow. And I just try really hard to make sure that I'm always ending my pitch, spiel, conversation on a really positive, happy, enthusiastic note. And if I've asked them for a change that's really big, then that is in the hopes of actually getting a small change. You know what they say, you always ask for more than you want. So I go in and I say, here's the ideal, this is what we'd love for you to do, it would be awesome. And then if they come back and they're like, well, we can't, that's a lot. Like I'm busy in my practice and all these people. And then I come back around and I say, well, how about we just do this? And I give them one tiny little portion of that change that we really inevitably want them to get to. And all of a sudden it doesn't look like such a huge thing. So we've shown them the end goal, and then we've asked them to take one tiny little baby steps. And when we first started talking about this, and I thought I was going to do like a presentation, I was going to call it baby steps, because that seems to be like the theme in my head, is that we really just want you, we just want you to dip your toe in the water. We don't need you to be huge, big change all at once. We wouldn't expect that of ourselves, and we don't expect that of you. But if you can just commit to starting the process with us, we'll be right there with you till the end.
I love that, Jess, and it really leans on a lot of the behavior change models and theories. You're not going to go from pre-contemplation to, yeah, I'm all in 22 minutes. Right. So I think the baby steps piece is so key. And also, yeah, asking for more and then paring it down is great. I learned that as a kid. When I wanted $5, I'd ask for 10. So definitely something that that we all hopefully have some sort of practice with. The other piece I wanted to follow up on, and I think I'll turn this to Jackie, when you're thinking of sort of the selling it, you know, I know that a big part of what we try to teach at NaRCAD is you're not selling a product. And if you're passionate about what you do, then asking for something really isn't as scary as it sounds. Talk to us about how you close up a visit.
So I will say this is one of the areas where initially I felt the most trepidation, because I don't have a theater background. I want something kind of scripted, and the whole movability of the close was very intimidating for me. And so I practiced and I scripted and things like that. And so some of the things that feel the most natural and resonate the most with me are something like, we've gone down quite a few different pathways today. Where do you see your next steps for this practice? I also like things like, what additional tools and resources do you need to make some changes within your practice as you see it? Partly because then that also gives me a chance to do a second visit and to maybe find some of those tools and resources for them and demonstrate more of a service to the practice. I like, what do you think implementation might look like for you? So I like for them to identify specifically for themselves. And sometimes that's especially helpful if different people are in the room, like a practice manager or something like that. I've seen practices go from, I don't have any intention to do any of this, to, well, maybe we could do some phone calls. And it really helps to have some of those other folks in the room, some of those voices sometimes that can identify that, yes, you do have the bandwidth for this, and to do some brainstorming and things like that. So the open-ended of, why don't you tell me what you think the next steps would look like for you has been very helpful for me.
Fantastic. So I'm hearing two things here. The first is, instead of approaching the sort of end point and the commitment as a black and white yes or no, which also raises the risk of you being rejected in that moment, saying, how realistic does this sound? You know, these open-ended questions kind of stealing from that great approach to needs assessment. You're assessing the ability or their perceived ability to implement these changes. And so that way, when they tell you how realistic they think it is, or they tell you some of the potential workflow challenges, resource and staffing challenges, you can then kind of hone in on an ask that takes that into account. And I think that's really lovely. The other piece you hit on, Jackie, that I think is so important is making sure that whether other staff members are accessible or not, that you ask. So a lot of times with our opioid specific trainings for folks across the states and beyond who are looking at, how do I just get somebody to check the PDMP? I mean, it's the law and things like that. And of course, the approach of, hey, it's the law is not unlike saying to somebody who is a chain smoker, hey, chain smoking is bad for you. So that kind of thing isn't always going to help. But I think saying, why doesn't this seem tenable, or how tenable does this seem? And if they say, look, I know it's important, I'd love to do it, I just don't have the time. Asking them, is there anybody else on your team you trust? What are the skill sets across your team? That helps you be creative in making a link that might be super obvious to you, but in their sort of stressed out day to day, they haven't made that jump. And so a lot of times it's about looking at what's there and kind of pushing those pieces together. So I really like that. I'm going to turn it to Mary Liz. Mary Liz, when you're closing a session, and I know you are not a salesperson, but you always have that kind of sharp salesy look. How do you do that? And how has that been met largely? What are sort of your tips and tricks to share with the audience about how you really close the non-sale sale?
Actually, you know, as you're doing the detail session, sometimes you get acceptance as you're speaking. It may not be at the very end. It may be a continuous type of, oh yeah, I do that, I do that. When I get those type of reactions and somebody's saying yes to what I'm saying, I just want to like go a little bit further and say, well, tell me, you know, let me know how successful that was, you know, and just expand on that a little bit more, because somebody may say yes, and okay, great. So how are you going to do it? So I kind of delve a little bit more. So again, it's kind of teasing out and really seeing how they practice, I think is so important. And I also want to mention that, you know, you're not on your agenda, okay? Yeah, you have this plethora of evidence you're coming in with, everything that you've been so prepared with. And you go in and you want to say, oh, I got to get to this, get to that, get to that. But at the bottom line is, yes, you need to state why you're there, and you want to get that person to accept what you're saying. But make sure if they tell you yes, you also check, okay, like, how are you going to do this then? I always like to hear that too. And then that way, the next time you go in, you can say, so did that work out the way you say you were going to do it? So.
Love that, Mary Liz. And I'm going to tease you for a second. And folks on the call who have been trained by you are throwing into the chat box how awesome you are. So don't need to have people be scared of you. But there is one character that you do really well at our trainings, which is the overly affable clinician. And I think that's who you're talking about, either because they actually do what you're saying, or they are just kind of trying to get you out of the office. Oh, that sounds great. Oh, fantastic. And I've seen people train with Mary Liz and say, I mean, she's going to do it, so I think I did pretty good. Yeah. But there's that extra layer of, oh, you're already doing it, or you're going to do it. Tell me how that looks. So again, really framing it in a way where you're digging for the next layer of information and not necessarily taking things at face value. And I love what you had to say about, it sounds to me like some of what you're saying is you're gaining acceptance in certain ways across the arc of the visit. And if you're paying attention to those details and those signs, and especially the nonverbal cues, then getting to the end also gives you more of a sense of what direction you'll go in when you're asking for a specific commitment. I love that. Yeah. Right. Did you want to reflect on that? Yeah.
I agree. And I think the closing should be a summation of what you talked about, right? So as you're going along, there are different steps you have to take when you're detailing, and different steps. And, academic detailing, it's not a science. It's not like we can tell you every detailed session is going to be like this. It's like today, right? Today is like a detailed session with Bevan. And, it's probably easier to give a presentation because you know what you're going to talk about, right? You've got your slides and everything, your PowerPoints, whatever, but you have to roll the punches and just kind of listen, respond, and also just be if somebody's saying yes to everything, I really do believe that is the hardest, because sometimes they do just kind of want to get you out. But that's when you have to delve a little bit more and just, oh, I see you're agreeing, you know, so let's reflect on that. So.
Terrific, terrific. I'm starting to see questions come into the chat box, which is great because I really want to open it up to everybody else. And Narissa has a question from Chicago, the Chicago team, the Illinois Advanced team, that I think really picks up on what you were just saying so well, Mary Liz. So when you're coming in and you just said, you know, it's actually easier in a way to be able to give a presentation because you know what the parameters are. She says, any tips to balance personal preference and comfortability to use scripts while also being able to pivot to being conversational and adaptable? And she identifies that she herself is an introvert. I'd love to throw this question out to all three of you, and starting with Jackie, and tell us, are you an introvert, extrovert? How do you balance your time, your energy, and also being able to pivot from that plan Mary Liz was talking about? You're going in with all your evidence, you have so many tools, and sometimes you just have to throw it out the window. So Jackie, talk to us about the pivot, and also how are you in the world in terms of your personality type, and what do you have to adapt to when you're in a session?
So I would say I tend towards the introvert, so I can identify. For me, what has helped is to really try to put myself in the shoes of providers in advance. And so scripting, yes, but also, okay, well, so they might go this direction. Then what could I say? Oh, well, they might have this question. So how would I identify that? So I tend to try to learn as much as I can about the providers in advance. That helps so that I know if they are a very tech savvy practice, what kinds of questions might they ask on that topic? If I know that they are a very small practice, if they're very rural, you know, just kinds of whatever I can do to sort of in advance do some anticipating of their potential questions. That has helped me quite a bit.
I love that, Jackie, and I know you are hardcore about doing some sleuthing in advance. I mean, Jackie, she's like Dragnet, just going through Google stalking.
I stalk them.
Yep.
Yeah, I stalk them.
And really figuring out not just, hey, I'm real prepared with my script, but I'm real prepared to not just say, oh, well, it could go this way, and saying, oh, it's likely to go this way because this is such a small practice. They don't even have a website. They only have one full-time, doc on. So again, that's some really, important legwork to do up front. Jess, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to guess you're an extrovert, but I think you could also not be. You might just be super outgoing and still need your time to recharge. So talk to us about your approach and how you balance your own energy and all of that good stuff.
So I probably fall somewhere in the middle. Coming out of theater, I'm used to being in front of people. But when you're doing that kind of theater or teaching, I was a teacher for a number of years as well, you've really prepped what you're going to say in that situation. You have a really good handle on your material if you haven't memorized your lines completely. So that takes that nervousness about being yourself and letting part of your own vulnerability come through. That's the harder part for me as an individual, is letting my own kind of insecurities sit in the room and be okay with that, and recognize that providers are probably feeling the exact same way too. So for me, it's knowing what I'm going to talk about, having a really good handle on my material and the evidence and all of the facts, but then going in and being able to just separate that and be a human being and have a conversation with these people. Making eye contact is a huge thing, as far as getting that initial connection started with the provider. But unlike Jackie, we don't know who we're going to visit when we go up here in New Hampshire. The University of New Hampshire did a little bit of research for us and found out that the most effective way to get into a doctor's office here in New Hampshire is to just do it cold. Show up at the practice, have no idea where you're going to be. So we kind of target a geographical area. I go around to different kind of specific types of providers, say a PCP or a pediatrician or an urgent care facility, whatever it may be. But I don't know that particular practice. So I have to know my material, and then I have to be willing to engage with whoever it is there on a genuine, real basis. And I think that's the key. It's just be willing to talk to people, be yourself. And being new, I also say that right away. when I'm having the conversation. If I have to go back and check my notes, I say, I'm really new to this. It's a really new program. Give me a second. Let me just check this, make sure I went over everything I wanted to go over. And do you have any other questions for me?
Awesome. Yes, that vulnerability is key. We are people first. And I think a lot of what you all are talking about, you know, it might be interesting to sort of explore the ways in which folks who are new and are anxious and are trying to build that confidence, what are sort of some tips besides, hey, it's going to happen? And then the flip side of that is, what would you say are some key elements or skills you need to have as a detailer that are critical, that if you don't have them, you need to get them brushed up or start figuring out how to sort of get those as soon as possible and build on those. So let me start with the first part, and then we'll go to the second part. Mary Liz, what are your thoughts?
So I would think just having a sound knowledge base of your material. If you don't have that, your credibility is destroyed. Because why else would you want to be with that person and basically waste their time? So you have to have a really sound knowledge base of that material. And you never know when you're talking with the detailing, if something comes up and you really don't know the answer to it, right? So that's when, again, a good time to build your credibility, and you say, let me get back to you on that. And you do that. Also, I think that a good listener, you have to be a good listener. If not, you might as well, it's not detailing. It's not. And Bevan, you mentioned this, and this is what I always say as well. It's a conversation that you have to have. And I do truly believe that, because if you're not conversing, it's not detailing. So I think that listening skill is so important, and your good evidence-based knowledge base that you have to come in with.
Excellent, excellent. And I see so many pro-introvert comments in the chat box. Introverts are awesome. They just need to plan to be impulsive. I love that from Kettle in Norway. Victor Ramirez says, introverts are terrific at listening, as did Jean Stillwell say that. Being able to understand where the other person is coming from and making it clear you're not just interested in delivering your pitch and not listening, which also undermines your credibility, along with, as Mary Liz said, not knowing your stuff. But Mary Liz also brought up a key piece here too, which is you are not expected to be the Google scholar of every topic. You can't possibly know everything. It's not Jeopardy. And so what you're going in to do is know as much as you can, but also to be comfortable saying, I'm the connector of information too. I like to say that librarians are not expected to have read every book in the library, but they know where to find those books, and they know who some of the best authors and you know, folks who analyze things and make critical commentary are. So if you are in that space where you're a whiz about content, but you also know that you can't possibly stuff your brain with every piece of info, especially as it keeps coming out quicker and quicker. So I love that. We did have a question up here that I would love to share. It is specific to opioids, but I think it can be translated too. Sachin Patel says, can you make some suggestions or tips on how detailers can make the topic of opioids and chronic pain relative to inpatient or hospital prescribers? And I think, you know, any answers here about that, or looking at how to support hospitalists versus looking at a primary care practice would be useful information. So Mary Liz, I'll start with you.
So with hospitalists, you know, they see them in such a short amount of time for the most part, I would think. I would say, you know, maybe the tapering part may be really important with opioids. I'm not sure exactly what the question was, Bevan. I wasn't reading the chat.
Sure. I've got it right here for you. So the question is just kind of looking at how can you take a topic like chronic pain relevant to hospitalist prescribers who are probably dealing more with acute pain. That might not be something, you know, that is we can dive into too much today. May also throw it to Jerry and Mike. But I think the larger question is sort of how do you pivot towards folks in different settings? So when you're meeting with somebody who's in the ER or in a hospital, what's a different approach you take, or maybe even a similar approach that's just executed a little bit differently than when you're meeting someone in a family, you know, PCP setting?
Right. Again, there's that relationship building, right? So a hospitalist is a short amount of time. They see the patients as well as primary care. But at the same time, I would think maybe get to the tapering or polypharmacy, coming up from that end of things. I hope that's what kind of answers that question. I'm not really sure if I'm getting to the answer.
Yeah, I think so. And Sachin, if you have a further question about that, we can either unmute you or you can pop it in the chat box. Just let us know. For other folks who may have questions, please go ahead and pop those in the chat box. I think we're making lots of strides here. Would love to also just kind of share a few questions that come out for all of our new trainees about something that might be dreaded to talk about, but we've got to talk about it. Gaining access. It is one of the hardest things to do. Folks have so many different approaches based on where their organization is located, who they're trying to meet as a provider. I'd love to know some gaining access tips and tricks, which sound sometimes like they might be similar to, the visit itself, being persistent, being open, not taking things personally. Jess, talk to us about how your program, I know you do a lot of cold calling, which is one of the scariest things that I think folks do not want to do. Talk to us about how cold calling has its pros and cons, and hopefully we'll focus on the pros.
So with cold calling, I discovered that first impressions were hugely important. It was more about discovering what I shouldn't do as opposed to what I should do. Because I work for public health, I am a representative of the state of New Hampshire and the greater, division of public health. So I discovered right away that if I wore my ID badge in the door, it was like, the state is here. What did we do wrong? Are they coming to punish us in some sort of way? Did we not file a form? All of those kind of things. So off went the badge. I don't think I've seen it in like a year. I have no idea where it is. And I also found that it's really super important to detail the whole practice and not just a provider. So those first cold call visits aren't necessarily about meeting with a doc or a PA or a nurse practitioner. It's about detailing that person who's at the front desk, the gatekeeper, the practice manager, and just coming in with a super positive attitude. I bring some materials for them so they can see that what we're going to be talking about, what we want to talk about is really useful. I hopefully have some tools that they can put into practice right away. And I'm really sure that my body language is just relaxed and welcoming and open. And I think as soon as they realize that we're not there to like eat up valuable time, in some way tell them that they're doing things wrong, and that we really just want to be supportive for them and do whatever we can to help them give better care to their patients, then that can turn the whole switch around and get your foot in the door for that next visit.
Excellent. Thanks, Jess. That's really great. And I do see here that the community, the audience is helping each other answer other questions. So Kelly Kretzer shared an answer with Sachin Patel about her approach to dealing with hospitalists for interventions on opioid safety. Jean Stillwell, thanks so much for this question. We're not having great success so far getting in the door with emails as a first contact. Do folks in general have better luck with a cold phone call? So we know that Jess shows up in person and just, kind of make sure they can't get away. And probably you can't do that right now, Jess. Mary Liz, talk to us about PACE and IDIS and how those first connections are made. And I know that you do have long-term relationships with folks from over the years, but if you can take us back to maybe first points of contact, that would be great.
Sure. So I think it's really important to emphasize that in Pennsylvania, we're a voluntary program, so we're not mandatory. So I think that's really important. A lot of the programs in the United States are mandatory where they have to be seen by a detailer. But in Pennsylvania with IDIS, it's strictly voluntary. So that means possibly knocking on doors, having the head of PACE, pharmaceutical assistance contract for the elderly who supports our program, possibly write letters to the primary care physicians. Also, knocking on the door sometimes does help. Also, I think referrals can be very good. If a physician, nurse practitioner, or PA really like what you're doing, you could get that referral base as well. Do you know anybody else who would like to, could benefit from this work? And also just grand rounds. I've actually been on a few visits where I may see a head of cardiology. And this happened to me once, and all of a sudden he said, come on in, you guys. This happened to me actually a few times now I think about it. And they brought in a bunch of residents as I was speaking. So, and then they invited me to the grand rounds after. So sometimes that referral base can be really, really great. Also, those of you who are demographically situated around a city, like I work in the suburbs of Philadelphia. So we do have a lot of healthcare systems that have residency programs. So that's a really nice way as well to just kind of talk to residents too, if you want, and that really can expand your referral base as well. So, and the last thing I want to mention is that champion, somebody who really, really likes your program, can really speak on behalf of you, especially if that person could be a chair or a division head of a program somewhere in a healthcare system. They can possibly bring you in and introduce you in some type of meeting. So that's also a great way. So I could go on, but I mean, you give presentations, you know, if you're asked to go and give a presentation and say COPD or whatever, so.
I love that, Mary Liz, and I think what it is stepping back and thinking about how do we network in general? How do we meet people in our lives? And a lot of it is just exposure. And sometimes folks who are really struggling at the beginning do say that those staff meetings, those lunch and learns, just really being ready to say, you know what, this isn't classic detailing. It's not what I was hoping for, but let me get out there and do it that way. So if I'm meeting, 12 clinicians in a practice, and 3 of them decide to sign up after a lunch and learn, then that's great. And if I do well with them, they may get some of those other folks who were on the fence to say, hey, I met with Mary Liz, and it's actually pretty cool. You should check it out. A lot of that is the way that we do anything, the way that we decide, hey, did you have somebody, do leaf blowing? Was he nice? Was she nice? So honestly, it's really word of mouth is just so impactful. Would love to, before I respond to a question from Jillian and Draka, just ask Jackie and Jess if they'd like to talk a little bit about relationship building across their respective jurisdictions. Jackie, I know you're in Oklahoma City, but you also work rurally. And Jess, I know that most of it is rural for you. So what kinds of sort of alliances, associations, coalitions, relationships do you leverage when you're trying to gain access? Jackie, I'll start with you.
Sure. So I absolutely echo the sentiment about if you have a great experience, ask someone else, would they mind sharing your information with their colleagues? That's really, really helpful. One of the things that I do just kind of to start the visit is I kind of treat that initial contact as a mini detailing session. So with the practice manager or somebody on the phone to kind of go through some features and benefits of what I'm going to be saying to their providers, I think has been very helpful. Also echoing the sentiment, basically get in all the rooms that you can. So being on a call for Project Echo or a county health board or something like that. So just basically any situation that you have an opportunity to be in is exposure, and almost always will lead to at least one new connection.
Love that. Our chat box is blowing up, so I'm going to actually skip you, Jess, for a minute and go on back to 2 more questions. So right before Jillian's questions, I did miss a question from Brian Abascal from San Francisco. I'm curious in hearing people's experience detailing BIPOC providers. That acronym is Black and Indigenous people or people of color, especially when the detailer is white. Well, all 3 ladies here seem to be, I'm guessing that you are white. Sorry for making any, assumptions, but wondering if there are any sort of dynamics around race, privilege, and humility that come up, without insulting physicians of color. So thoughts about that. Jess, I think New Hampshire is not as diverse as we would hope, just having lived there in high school. Mary Liz, since you are closer to Philly, can we have you share any of that? Are there, strategies that you look at when you are trying to kind of check your privilege and things like that? It's a great question, Brian. I don't know that we've ever had it before.
Yeah, it is a great question, Brian. And honestly, I'm outside of Philadelphia, like I said, and I don't see any real biases at all. I mean, I've worked in Philadelphia, so I personally don't see any biases when I practice. Some issues do come up with some of the modules that we've done that may have something where we have to indicate like obesity and the Black race and the diets and things like that. We get into that. So sometimes we have to modify, our talks with that, but that's all with the evidence, right? The CDC guidelines comes out with some things as well. But when it comes to actually looking at disparities, I really don't find that when I'm detailing. And I detail people of all colors and races and female, male, whatever. So I really don't.
I'd love to unmute Brian for a second, Anna, if you can help us with that, because Brian, you've been on so many of our calls and we're colleagues, and I'd love you to provide even more context. I know you're in San Francisco where there's a lot more diversity than, say, New Hampshire. Sorry, not to rag on New Hampshire, Jess. So Brian, talk to us some more about kind of your question and some context for that.
Sure. So, given all of the recent police brutality and sort of focus on how our country is dealing with, a renewed perception of, the white supremacy that we've been socialized to just accept as being the norm. Sorry, I'm out of breath because I was like running from downstairs, but
sorry to put you on the spot.
That's okay. It's okay. So just how, like, how do you approach BIPOC providers, coming in with your own humility, right? Because you're trying to, like, educate them and do behavioral change, which sometimes, if not done with humility, can come off as a microaggression, and so I'd just love to hear people's, like, mechanisms of, like, doing that with a little bit, with some care, and if there's anything that they do differently, or if it's something that maybe they just do across the board because, you're coming in trying to get a provider to change. You don't want to insult them by making it seem like they don't know, they don't already know, that kind of thing.
That makes sense, Brian. And I'm curious as to folks who have come up against this and how to be part of their detailing sessions to go ahead and pop some thoughts into the chat box. Obviously, not as a person of color, you can take this with a grain of salt, but I do think, Brian, that part of it is also potentially not being afraid if you're walking in as a detailer who has, inherent privilege, being white or being male. Coming in and saying, I want to be respectful of any cultural differences. If I'm missing something, I apologize, and I would love to hear your perspective. Or saying up front, I certainly don't mean to, talk about how to deal with a diverse population that you see every day and I have less experience with. So I think actually, coming out and saying it is a way to say, I'm trying to approach with sensitivity, and also I'm not an expert and I don't have learned experience, while also making sure you're not asking a potential clinician of color to school you, right? To put that pressure on them to be the people that, try to tell, those of us who are white and are, represent the majority, how we should be more culturally supportive. So I think it's finding that sweet spot. I think it's identifying it and validating that it exists. And then also potentially looking as a detailing community in how can we be more robust and inclusive in looking at that in our trainings and our evidence reviews, similar to what Mike was talking about at the beginning of day one. So it's clear we have a lot of work to do here, and that this is something that we, as a community need to investigate a bit more. So with that said, I want to make sure we still get to the questions that I promised to answer a few minutes ago. But Brian, I want to thank you for bringing up something important that we don't think about enough, and let you know that at NaRCAD, we have over this past year discussed that we need to be more focused and less, be more aware of our blind spots in terms of thinking about health disparities. And also, again, this thought about how do we approach clinicians who either are people of color or who are, representing and supporting on the daily groups who are, vastly comprised of patients of color. So thank you for that. What I'd like to do is, as promised, and I see the chat box continuing to blow up, go back to Jillian, Andreka, does anybody have experience with detailers that don't have the same background as the provider being detailed? With that in mind, I'd love to throw it to Jess because I just saw her smile and throw her hand up. Jess, what happens for you when you go in and meet with, say, a family practice doc to talk about HIV prevention and sexual health? Have you ever come up with against a situation where you have either felt that there is some sense of judgment or that you need to approach something differently as a non-doc?
Yeah, so I'm not clinical in any way, shape, or form. I'm not an MA, an RN, a pharmacist, nothing. I have no clinical background whatsoever. And my supervisor does not either. So our whole program is made up more of people who are educators and public health folks. So yeah, I have definitely walked into a few practices where people look at me and give me the old up and down, like, you're gonna tell me something I don't already know. But I come back, and I'm very lucky to work with public health in that whole librarian kind of thing that you were talking about earlier, in that I don't have to know everything. It's my job to be able to help you find that information easily and quickly and be able to put it into practice. So I sit when I'm in the office amongst the best group of public health nurses and epidemiologists and doctors and veterinarians who do know all the answers about tick-borne viruses and sexual health and E. coli and anything public health I have access to. And that's what I tell docs, especially, who go, what are you going to tell me? And I said, well, this is what we're here to talk about. This is what I've prepared. These are the resources I have. But if you need more information, I can absolutely connect you with a subject matter expert that would be happy to discuss these things ad nauseum with you until all of your questions are answered and you feel really confident about moving forward in your practice and making changes that are going to be helpful for you and your patients.
Thanks, Jess. That's terrific. I want to also share that some folks in the chat box are still talking about Brian's questions, so please go ahead and follow up on that. And read that if you'd like. So there was a question about COVID-related challenges, and I'm trying to grab all your great questions. This is definitely the most jam-packed chat box we've had yet over these 3 days, and I'm excited that you're keeping me on my toes. All right, great question about how are you all dealing with COVID-related challenges? We can get a blurb from each of you about how you're pivoting or have been pivoting during this time. Jackie, let's start with you. How have you noticed your detailing program have to shift? What shifts have you made? What challenges do you have, etc.?
So just like everybody else, we have had to do some pivoting to Zooms, but mostly for us, our providers have wanted to do phone calls. And so that has been maybe a little bit unique for us, not really exactly sure what the pulse is for everybody else out there, but it has really helped me up my game in terms of making sure that my verbiage is saying what I mean for it to say, and really asking those clarifying questions of the providers. This is what I hear you saying. Am I interpreting this correctly? Because I don't have that nonverbal to sort of draw from also.
Excellent, excellent. And I'm wondering too, if Mary Liz, I know that you, after doing this work for so many years, have been taking your first foray into e-detailing. Tell us how that's been, and also other considerations and questions that have come up for you during sessions that are about COVID, maybe even prior to or informed, that help inform the clinical topic you're there to detail about.
Yeah, sure, Bevan. So I think it goes along with the title of this whole presentation, and that is empathy. This is a time none of us have experienced, right? That's number one. So some of the people who I've seen or spoken to may have people that are very sick. They may have been sick, have family members that have been sick. So much more than any time I've ever detailed. So there's a lot more emotions right now, a lot more psychological, just emotions, really. It really has been. So I wanted to start off with that, saying this is really the title of this whole presentation, and that is empathy. So I want to start off by saying that. And then, it has changed a lot because, usually you walk in, you're sitting in their office or whatever, doing your detail. And, to go to a Zoom, a lot of it has been very challenging, trying to just communicate, right? Because the offices are closed, how to get a hold of this person, you know, getting to answer machines and everything. So it's been very, very frustrating. But those you can connect with, they're still so appreciative of getting that evidence still. One thing I do want to say is, which always been a challenge, which I'm sure you all have been in this situation, is time. Their time is so much more valuable now. And some of them don't like being, you know, here on Zoom. Some would rather have phone calls, like Jackie was just saying as well. So, you know, our visits in Pennsylvania have been a little bit down, but that's to be expected just because of the governmental regulations right now as to getting in offices. And that's been shifting back and forth too. And by the end of the week, that may shift back too. So, you know, we have to be a little bit like Gumby, right? Right now, we have to be adaptable to what's going on. So.
I love that. I think I might have to squeeze in a Gumby slide to the end of today. Excellent. All right, we have a couple more before we wrap up. If I missed anybody, Winnie, help me keep on my toes as you've been doing so beautifully. Vishal says, oh, sorry, Vishal, that's not a question. You guys are just chatting with each other. Ashley Allison says, for those of you that had already established sort of in-person detailing programs and then you pivoted to virtual, do you plan moving forward to, you know, kind of go back to in-person when it's possible and just do that? Or are you seeing that there's a way to integrate both that might be a benefit, having that sort of hybrid approach? Jackie, what do you think? Have you guys thought about this yet? Or is it one of those things where it kind of seems too far off yet to understand?
So it's something that the providers that I have interacted with have expressed a very strong preference to be in person whenever possible. So I don't foresee for our program, although it would be nice not to drive 3.5 hours to do a visit, they so much value the in-person interaction that whenever possible, we're going to move back to that just as soon as we can.
Sounds good. Jess, what do you think? I know you're big on the cold calling and showing up and just bombing them with evidence. So
yeah, I kind of feel the same way Jackie does as far as what providers like. They really like that one-on-one, be able to see your face, have that like materials in their hand kind of deal. But I also see this being really usable in a hybrid fashion, you know, like schools are doing half the time in person and half the time remotely. For those of us who are in a really rural place, or maybe you're the only person in your state doing it, like I am, I'm the only full-time detailer here in New Hampshire. My coworker Megan does do some part-time, but to be able to not have to drive in February 3 hours in New Hampshire through the mountains, and yet still be able to meet people and see them, even if it's through a camera, maybe that's that initial contact that we get made so that going forward in June, when it's a lovely drive through the mountains, I can then go up and see them in person next time and grow that relationship and really build that trust. So yeah, I kind of think a hybrid model might work really well going forward here. Megan, I know you're watching. I hope you agree.
Megan is Jess's colleague. And I think, you know, it really does, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It really does depend on where you're hailing from, what terrain you need to cover. I know we have a lot of our fantastic detailers from Canada here who, wow, if there was ever, you know, a cause for e-detailing versus traveling many a mile, you know, that would be it. Although I do know that Lauren Regier once took a helicopter to a detailing session, which if you haven't done that yet, put it on your list. All right, we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. I want to just say it's been so terrific to have all 3 of you let us pick your brain and put you under the microscope. And, you know, I want to make sure folks have a chance to ask one more question of these experts. Go ahead and pop it in the chat box. And before we see those final questions, just going to put you on the spot one more time to say, what are your 1, 2, or 3 nuggets that you would share to anybody who is nervous or is burnt out in this field to just kind of keep things going? I know all 3 of you are very positive, but what are some positive and yet realistic ways to approach this work? Mary Liz, let's start with you.
Okay, number 1 would be your impact you can have on patient outcomes. Okay, that to me is number 1. Okay, so right there, I would say if you can improve patient outcomes, and that is get to the primary care provider, give them the best evidence to provide the best care. I think that should be number one. Number two would be persistent. You know, even in the days where your detail may not have gone as well, which I certainly have had, you go back and it may be a great detail the next time. So you don't know. And lastly, it's that resilience piece too, is just being able to, almost like persistence, right? It's kind of, they go hand in hand, but at the same time, it's just being strong-minded and confident when you go in, and knowing that evidence, I think will get you a long way. And caring.
Thank you, Mary Liz.
Yeah.
Oh, you can have 4 nuggets. There's so many nuggets, but yeah, it sounds like these are all less about know your evidence, right? And more about the stuff that in many cases you kind of can't teach, you can learn, but again, you can be that clinical expert who maybe is just so top notch with all of the up-to-date knowledge, but if you're not able to persist, be resilient, and just kind of keep moving forward, that's tricky. And we have a note from Anaya who's sharing a nugget. Don't take anything personally, right? It's not personal, which is tough because the work itself feels very personal. Jess talked about being vulnerable, going in and showing up, not just with your detailer hat, but as a person. Yeah, so thanks. Oh, and Maria, thank you very much. I noticed that you have your name backward. My apologies. I know Anaya is your last name. All right. What are some nuggets from you, Jess? Give us your top 3 if you can.
Celebrate your wins, every single one. Everything that goes well, really like own it and be happy for those wonderful events that go just the way they're supposed to, or even better than you anticipated.
Beautiful.
Things that don't go so well, but don't beat yourself up about it. Go back and look and see what it was that made it not go so well, and maybe see what you could do differently to kind of have a better experience next time. And being that teacher and that theater person, practice, practice, practice before you ever get in the door. Just do it to all your colleagues, sit your significant other down. I detail the dog, you know, whatever you've got to do. Get yourself feeling comfortable with the material and be able, like muscle memory, build that muscle memory about what you're doing.
Excellent, Jess. Thanks so much. And if you are too nervous to do it to a dog or you don't have a dog, a plant always works, a mirror works. Sometimes if it feels really scary, just audio record yourself and listen to your tone. Am I going too fast? Am I going too slow? Am I speaking in run-on sentences, which I am always guilty of? Over to Jackie. Jackie, what are your nuggets as we wrap up today?
So I would say just keep in mind every practice has a need, and you have some way to help them meet that need. And so just kind of to keep that at the fore is really helpful. And then I just want to end with channeling my inner Stuart Smalley. You are good enough, you are smart enough, and doggone it, people like you.
Beautiful. I'm trying to write that down without giggling, but it's true. All right, so if anybody else has any additional nuggets to throw in, I see one from Wayne Smith, which is just really beautiful. If you are detailing opioids, you are saving lives. How much more motivation do you need? And I would say that applies across any topic you're doing. Every single topic you're doing, every time you are walking in that door and trying to have a conversation, you are having an impact. And don't forget that it doesn't need to be such a concrete impact that, you know, we're all fixated sometimes on the quantitative data, which is critical to see our impact. But don't forget that the relationship building is as important, and that's the core of, you know, how we, you know, have learned to think about it from Jerry with his original studies and creating this model. And what we really think about here at NaRCAD is the relationship is the core, and being able to communicate the worth of what you're bringing is so critically important. Michelle, yes, the slides will be available. And yes, all topics have an impact. So again, please be proud of the work you're doing. I know that we are all proud to call you our colleagues, Mary Liz, Jackie, and Jess. We will let you cut about a few minutes early for lunch. And thank you so much, guys. This has been a really great panel. We appreciate you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, everybody.
Super fun.
Thank you so much. All right, so I'm going to throw the slide deck back up so you can see that we will resume at 12:30 Eastern Standard Time. We look forward to seeing you then. Please keep your Zoom platform logged in so that at 12:30 we can kick off for a fantastic special presentation on innovations in HIV detailing. Thanks, everyone. Have a great lunch break.
Thank you.
Especially Mary Liz, Jackie, and Jess for such a jam-packed session, and for, as Mary Liz said, feeling detailed in the moment. Certainly wasn't what I hoped you felt, but since you're so good at it, I'm sure it wasn't hard. All right, so for those of you coming back in and putting back on your cameras, we're going to do a very quick round of poll everywheres prior to an upcoming special presentation on innovations in HIV prevention and treatment. And this will be our chance to get a sense of what some of you think is important for frontline clinicians who are involved and invested in ending the HIV epidemic. So if you are already on Poll Everywhere, thanks so much. If not, please go ahead and follow the prompt, and we will take it away. All right. So what supports or resources for clinicians would make ending the HIV epidemic possible? What do frontline clinicians need in hand to make this happen? All right, kicking off. We have data. We have data again. Yes. Evidence, patient resources, better sexual history taking, yes, encouragement, support with the conversation, a way to avoid patient loss to follow-up, destigmatizing sex, brief intervention database evidence research, yes, vaccines, PEP and PrEP, social supports, adherence coaching, money. Always an issue. What else as we get resettled in after lunch? Any other thoughts? Looks like a couple more folks saying reducing stigma, which is of course important. Building comfort is a big part of reducing stigma, building comfort in talking about this kind of content, and more overall sex conversations. Yes. All right. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Mike to introduce our kickoff presenter for this special presentation, Don Smith. Mike, take it away.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody, for a great day so far, and welcome back from lunch. Really excited for this session. Just by way of brief introduction, for all of us have had different experiences in the healthcare space, but for someone like me, thinking about remembering so well before I was pre-med or in med school, when we started learning about HIV and AIDS, and then the more acute phase when I was in my training, we had inpatient wards of patients with AIDS and acute complications we were admitting to the phase we're in now, when a title slide like Dawn's, who I'll hand over to in a minute, that includes ending the HIV epidemic, is a realistic slide to put up at a conference, is a remarkable thing to see. And so the opportunity for all of us in our academic detailing community to engage with our colleagues who've been doing so much work on thinking about how treatment and prevention of HIV really could end the epidemic, and how we could be contributors to that international effort, is really exciting. So our first speaker, I'll introduce Dawn first, and then the other speakers as we transition to their presentations. But Dawn is the Biomedical Interventions Activity Lead in the Epidemiology branch of the Division of HIV/AIDS Prevention at the US CDC. Dawn originally did her MD here. Well, I say here because our team's in Massachusetts at UMass Med School. She's also has an MPH in Public Health Policy and an MS in Clinical Research Design and Statistical Analysis. She's been a practicing family physician, has done research both in the US and internationally on many aspects of HIV care and prevention, with her particular focus on interventions to reduce new HIV infections in the US, particularly the development of guidelines for the use of PrEP. And so she's the perfect person to give us an overview, help all of us understand both the moment and the opportunity, and set us up to hear about two really exciting projects from the East and West coasts of the US. So Dawn, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. You know, in the early days of the epidemic, CDC was really limited to promoting individual behavior change, condom use, education about PrEP, et cetera. And there's been a revolution in the last several years when all of a sudden we also have these important biomedical tools, whether that's treatment for patients or whether that's pre-exposure prophylaxis. And that means that working with primary care doctors as well as infectious disease doctors and educating them about their role has become a critical part of what we're trying to do. Next slide. I have no conflicts. Next slide. So early last year, HHS, actually the president announced a new initiative called Ending the HIV Epidemic, a Plan for America. And HHS and CDC play critical roles in this effort. The goal is, in the next 10 years, to reduce the number of new HIV infections by 90%, and in the next 5 years to get a start by reducing it by about 75%. And this is being done in 3 phases. The first phase for the first 5 years is a focused effort to reduce new infections in the jurisdictions that account for 50% of new HIV infections. In phase 2, the idea is to take the lessons learned from phase 1 and move them out to the rest of the country to achieve further reductions. And then when we get down to where we want to be in phase 3, it will become an issue of intensive case management to keep the number low. Next slide. So the key actions or strategies for ending the HIV epidemic are, first of all, to expand testing and make it easier for people to determine whether they have HIV infection or whether they are negative but may benefit from some other prevention options. There are the projects that you're going to hear about today. I'm going to talk more about the prevent activities, but you're also going to hear about treatment because we know that if patients are treated and virally suppressed, that they can't transmit to other persons sexually. And so right now, about 63% of people are with HIV who are in care have virus suppressed. But we need to get it up to 95% as part of this. Go back one slide. As part of this effort. The prevent pillar is really about especially expanding pre-exposure prophylaxis to prevent people from acquiring HIV infection. Pre-exposure prophylaxis involves giving people a daily pill with an antiretroviral, which is, if you take it daily, is more than 95% effective in reducing your risk of HIV acquisition. Currently, about 18% of those people that we think have indications for PrEP use because of their risk behaviors are on PrEP. So there's a lot of work that we need to do to improve that. Next slide. Next slide. The reason why, in addition to having these tools available to us, we really are aware that the HIV epidemic really has stalled out at an unacceptably high level. This looks at the risk of a person who is uninfected at age 18, what their lifetime risk of HIV infection is. And what you can see is that there's a marked disparity that Among white men, for example, the chances are 1 in 132. But for African American men, it's 1 in 20. And if you narrow down further to MSM, who constitute 2/3 of new infections, 1 in 2 Black men would acquire HIV infection if in their lifetime if we don't do something different. 1 in 4 Hispanic MSM, and only 1 in 11 white MSM. Obviously, the only is only in comparison to these other populations. Next slide. But then when we look at PrEP coverage, so among those who are estimated to have risk behaviors that put them at high risk and would likely need PrEP, when we look at PrEP coverage by race, ethnicity, and sex, what we see is that on the left, it's by race. So among whites, for example, about 29% of persons with indications are white, but 42% of persons who are on PrEP are white. As opposed to Blacks, which account for almost 40% of those with indications for PrEP, but only 6% of those who were currently receiving PrEP in 2018. If we look by gender, we see a similar disparity where 81% of those with indications are men. Of those, about 21% were currently receiving PrEP. 19% roughly were women, but only 6% were on PrEP. So we're experiencing serious disparities as well. Next slide. We've spent a lot of time at CDC trying to educate primary care clinicians about PrEP with a variety of strategies. And you can see that at least in the National Doc Style Survey, the number who are aware of PrEP has gone up substantially. And we're now up to almost 90% of primary care docs who say they've heard of PrEP. But we still have only 12 to 15% who have ever prescribed PrEP. Next slide. So if we take a step back and we say, what do we know about how clinicians make decisions about whether to address conditions that really are based on lifestyle factors? So primary prevention practices. There was an interesting study which suggested that the decision really depends on whether providers make a commitment to it and whether they feel they have the capacity for it. The commitment part has to do with whether they think that the clients want them to engage with this lifestyle factor, whether they think that it's within their role as a clinician to be talking about these particular lifestyle factors, and whether they think that they would make a difference. In terms of capacity, whether they think that this kind of care is within the capacity of their clinic or their setting, whether they feel that they have the skills necessary to implement whatever the lifestyle change intervention is, and whether there's support within their institution for them engaging in that. If they have commitment and capacity, then you get to questions of, okay, so now what do I do? How do I address the lifestyle factors? And there are a number of roles that clinicians can take. They can be gatekeepers, they can serve primarily an educational function, or they can actually assist the patient in making that lifestyle adjustment. There's also the issue of what are the risk management practices that the clinician is prepared to undertake. So is it screening, and who will be screened and how often would they be screened? Or is it more of an intervention? So am I going to refer people on? I'm not going to give the intervention myself. Or I'm going to get increasingly involved in the actual delivery of the intervention. Next slide. So with respect to PrEP, what we're hoping at CDC is that we can make the adoption of PrEP as a clinical practice by primary care as simple as possible, recognizing that people are busy, recognizing that there are many new interventions that are being presented to primary care doctors every day. So with respect to PrEP, what we would like to see is that providers inform all sexually active patients about the availability of PrEP. You don't necessarily want to prescribe it to everyone, but we believe that everybody should be aware of it, what it is, and what it's used for. We hope that providers and clinics will find ways to use the EMR to implement routine HIV testing so that those who are negative can then have a more detailed discussion about PrEP, and those who are positive can be linked to care. And we hope that the EMR also will be useful to flag patients who have evidence in their EMR that indicates PrEP might be right for them. So that would be something like all patients who are diagnosed with syphilis or gonorrhea. We also think it's important that providers think about taking a team approach. Not everything related to PrEP needs to be done by a clinician. Some things can be done in a very passive way. So for example, on the right there, you see a poster that CDC makes available that could be, on the tables in the waiting room or on the wall in the places where patients would see it. And then I'll talk to you in a second about some questions that we want to suggest people use to determine who really has indications for PrEP. And some of those questions make clinicians uncomfortable, but there are other ways of getting those answers rather than face-to-face. And so we would suggest that sometimes it's appropriate to add some of those questions to the health history form that patients complete when they come into a clinic visit. Next slide. We understand that the majority of people who need PrEP are there because they have sexual behaviors that may expose them to HIV. And we understand that providers have hesitance to ask a lot of detailed sexual history questions. So the good news for PrEP is that there's really only a few questions that you need to ask. And so let me just walk this through. First of all, you want to know if people are sexually active. So have they had anal or vaginal sex in the past 6 months? You want to know if the men that you're seeing are MSM, and often they will not feel comfortable divulging that to providers. And so we suggest asking a routine question of men and women: do you have sex with men, women, or both? And make it clear to patients that you ask this of all your patients. If patients have an HIV positive partner, you want to ask as far as you know, are any of your partners positive? If they say yes, then you want to know if they have an undetectable viral load. If they don't, then that's a person that you want PrEP for. You also, if they say, no, I have no HIV positive partners, then you want to know, with those partners who are not known to have HIV infection, do you always use condoms? If the answer is no, then that's a person you want to have a conversation about PrEP with. And then there's the issue of bacterial STIs. Now, if this is your patient that you see regularly, you will know from the medical record. But if this is a new patient or a patient hasn't been in for a while, you might want to ask about bacterial STI diagnoses. If the answer is yes, then you would want to talk to them about prescribing PrEP. For injection drug use, it's even simpler. Have you ever injected drugs? If yes, have you injected in the last 6 months? If yes, do you share injection equipment at any point? And if the answer is yes, then you would prescribe them PrEP, or ask them if any of their injection partners are known to have HIV. And if the answer is yes, they would also be prescribed PrEP. sometimes you'll hear people say you need to ask an extensive, a complete sexual history. For PrEP, you don't. There may be other reasons why you want to go into a more detailed sexual history, but we're trying to make the offer of PrEP be as simple as possible. Next slide. Next slide. So the other question that comes up a lot with primary care providers is, look, I have a lot of things to do. Why do I need to wade into this? Is it really worth my while? I have very low risk patients, et cetera. We know that if we look at something called the number needed to treat, which is how many patients do you need to give an intervention to in order to prevent the outcome that you want? We know that PrEP stacks up very well with other primary care prevention activities that people are already engaged in. So for example, you routinely give statins to patients. Well, you have to treat 60 patients with statins in order to reduce the 5-year risk of a cardiac event. You have to treat 56 patients with ACE inhibitors to reduce death over 5 years. Metformin for diabetes, you have, for pre-diabetics, you have to treat only 14 people to reduce the risk of going on to full diabetes within a 3-year time frame. And so if you look at PrEP, for example, PrEP for all MSM, men who have sex with men, it's only 37 that you would need to treat to reduce the 1-year risk of an HIV infection. For those who are in a discordant couple where one person is positive and the other person is negative for HIV, you only have to treat 15. And as we saw, the risk for Black MSM is very high. You only have to treat 11 Black MSM to reduce the risk of one infection occurring over a year. So I think it is definitely something that's worth adding to the primary care armamentarium. When we look to see how often providers are seeing patients who should have been offered PrEP, didn't offer it, and then those patients went on to develop HIV infection, what we call missed opportunities. We can see in a variety of settings that this rate is much too high. So in New York City, for example, 42% of persons who seroconverted had a prior HIV negative test visit without provision of PrEP. In South Carolina, 25% of those who had a diagnosis of syphilis or gonorrhea had an average of 4 previous healthcare visits prior to the diagnosis of HIV and were not offered PrEP. In the VA, among patients with indications for PrEP, they have a very strong PrEP program in the VA, but nonetheless, 35% experienced delays in receiving PrEP, ranging from 6 weeks to 16 months, and saw some seroconversions while people were experiencing these delays. And in Alabama, among adolescents at a primary care clinic, 44% of the adolescents had PrEP indication, but none were offered or prescribed PrEP. So we really are working hard to get clinicians aware and active in the provision of PrEP to those who have indications. Next slide. At a population level, you can see that increasing PrEP is associated with reducing new infections. In New York State, for example, where their End the HIV epidemic activity has been going on for several years, they have had a marked increase in PrEP prescription over the last few years. And at the same time, they've had a significant reduction in new HIV diagnoses. Now, this is not all due to PrEP. Some of this is also due to expanding treatment and follow-up of patients who drop out of treatment. But some of this is probably due to PrEP increases as well. If you look at a clinic level, there was an interesting study where they looked at the risk of HIV infection in their population before they offered PrEP, while they were taking PrEP, and then among those who had stopped taking PrEP. And what you can see is that the patients who stopped taking their PrEP, believing that they were no longer at risk for some reason, really had the same incidence rate as those who were never prescribed PrEP. But those who were taking PrEP had a very close to zero incidence of HIV infection. Next slide. So for all these reasons, we believe that clinician PrEP detailing is a critical activity. And so we're really happy to be able to participate in the NaRCAD conference. Ending the epidemic really depends on clinicians. And so we want to incorporate PrEP as a primary care preventive health service. It has been rated with a grade A by USPSTF, which means that starting next year, there will be no out-of-pocket costs for patients who are prescribed PrEP. We need clinicians to identify which of their patients is at risk for acquiring HIV and provide PrEP to all patients who have risk, who need it. Also patients who ask for it, regardless of their estimated need, because there are times when patients won't be honest about what behaviors they've been engaged in. And if they think they need PrEP, it's best to trust them that they know what's in their best interest. And then providing support for adherence and persistent use of PrEP. We need to let primary care providers know that this process is as simple as preventive care that they're already being provided. Just like metformin and statin care, where we advise patients to lose weight, to change their diets, but we recognize the difficulty of that, and so we give them daily pills to take to reduce their risks of poor health outcomes. This is no different. Same thing with contraception for women at risk of unwanted pregnancy. The other thing we are learning as we work with detailing, and I think you'll hear some of this in the upcoming presentations, is that in addition to an initial detailing visit, because this is a new procedure, encouragement and support for ongoing practice change is going to be necessary. CDC has funded a PrEP hotline where clinicians can call and get advice and support while they're trying to deliver PrEP. But I think there are ways in which clinician detailing and more face-to-face encounters would also be helpful. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. So here's a list of kind of the resources that you might want to get started with. We have clinical practice guidelines, which are online. We have a provider supplement, which has additional information about, billing codes to use, about patient handouts, those kinds of things. And then we have a new website called HIV Nexus, which has a whole section on clinician activities related to HIV prevention and care. In terms of paying for the medication, there are 2 programs that will provide free drug for patients who do not have insurance coverage. The Gilead Medication Assistance Plan and the HHS Ready Set PrEP program. And then for patients who want to use the ACA health plan, the National Association of State and Territorial AIDS Directors website has a health plan calculator that, depending on where the jurisdictional specific, and they will help providers or benefits counselors to assist patients to find the best health plan. Next slide. Thank you, and questions.
So Don, I think what we'll do next is actually triage questions to the tail end so that folks can see the whole arc of, you setting the stage, an implementation, an intervention that'll be shared from New York, and then evaluation. And then we'll make sure that those of you who put some really great questions in the chat box for Don, that we get back to you. So thanks for being patient. And Mike, if you can introduce the New York team.
Absolutely. Thank you, Don. That was inspiring. As Bevan said, there's a lot of great comments and questions in the chat. So it's clearly this is a topic that connects with so many of you. And New York City has been a leader in this, so we're thrilled. They've presented it at prior sessions of the conference, and we're thrilled to have another program of theirs to hear about this year. Julianne Bell, who is the program manager of clinical operations for the Bureau of HIV, has been there since 2016, began in a research role, but now is with clinical operations and manages the team focused on providing data-driven technical assistance to HIV providers across New York City, and now thinking about e-detailing. Her partner in this presentation is Erica Daquila, who's the director of clinical operations for the Bureau of HIV. Works on many of the same issues, and she's also had a background working internationally. Erica, and she told us it was okay to mention this, unfortunately, had been out with COVID, but reported that she's doing well, and we're wishing her a speedy and complete recovery, but she wasn't able to join today. So Julianne will be speaking, but definitely wanted to give credit where it's due, because this was a joint submission and presentation. So excited to hear about this program. Whoops, Bevan, I think we may be having a sound issue.
Yep, we have a little glitch here. We're trying to unmute Julianne, and it's taking a moment. So thank you for your patience. And I know that we all do wish Erica the best in recovering from COVID. It is unfortunate that happened, because I know she and Julianne are such a power team. So I'll turn it over to Julianne now. Looks like we got her ready to go. Thanks, Julianne.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me?
Perfect.
Yes?
You're good.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry, I was having some technical difficulties, but I think it's worked out. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julianne Bell. I work with Clinical Operations and Technical Assistance Program in the Bureau of HIV at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And as Mike and Bevan just said, I would really like to acknowledge my colleague, Erica Daquila, who is the lead on the work and was supposed to be presenting with me today. She did contribute to this presentation. She is sick with COVID-19. She's doing okay, and I just want to wish her a speedy recovery. So I'll be presenting today on mine and Erica's team's data-driven detailing approach that we've been using for the last 2+ years to support our health department's efforts to end the HIV epidemic in New York City. And I do not have any conflicts of interest or relevant financial, non-financial relationships to disclose. So here's a quick outline of what I'll cover in this presentation. First, I'd like to quickly introduce you to our team and our program. Then I will provide an overview of the steps and an example of our data to detailing approach. Next, I will provide an outline of our new public health detailing campaign, which is focused on immediate antiretroviral treatment, or what we call IART for short. And finally, before Q&A, I'll present on the upcoming plan for our IART detailing visit. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. So to start us off, to talk about our program, you can go to the next slide, please. The Clinical Operations and Technical Assistance Program, or COTA as we go by, is a program within the Bureau of HIV at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And COTA offers the following support to clinical and non-clinical providers in New York City and across the Northeast region of the United States. Remote and on-site training on various HIV-related topics, on-site technical assistance, mentorship and consultations with subject matter experts, creation and dissemination of resource materials, facilitation of peer-to-peer learning, and public health detailing visits, which will be focused on today's presentation. Now, our programs within our Bureau have worked on PrEP academic detailing, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis, which focuses on HIV prevention. But I just want to be clear that today we're going to be talking on the HIV treatment side. So we will be focusing on our campaign that's focused on initiation of immediate ART, or IR as we call it. Okay, so next I'll go into talking about how CODA has been using a 4-step data to detailing approach to support the health department's efforts to end the HIV epidemic in New York City. In 2018, CODA's data to detailing approach was developed to establish strong working relationships with HIV clinic teams and to strengthen the capacity of clinical and non-clinical providers with the goal of improving viral load suppression rates among people with HIV. As displayed in the image featured here, the approach consists of 4 main steps. So first, data triangulation. Second, detailing preparation. Third, detailing execution. And fourth, evaluation. On the next few slides, we'll take you through each step of the approach and highlight an example of how we executed this approach using a very small budget and relying on already available data and resources. Step 1 of our approach is data triangulation. And what we mean by that is bringing together multiple sources of data on a particular topic to get a better understanding of how factors or systems may be working together to impact a primary outcome of interest. For us, we are interested in New York City's clinics' viral load suppression rates among people living with HIV. We reviewed 115 results from a citywide HIV clinic survey, and using a free software to develop individualized clinic reports, which summarize the HIV clinic survey data on a citywide and borough-wide and clinic type specific level. An example of one of these reports is featured here to the right. These reports were very informative for us to gain an understanding of how each clinic was performing on various HIV indicators compared to other clinics with similar characteristics. We also compiled additional data that was available for the same HIV clinics, such as treatment cascades, funding information, and testing data. Then we convened case conferences with colleagues to discuss the data, existing relationships, and past experiences with the clinic. By doing this type of data triangulation, we were able to prioritize topics that should be addressed during detailing. Next slide, please. The second step in our approach is detailing preparation, specifically the selection of tailored resources for detailing, which is largely dependent on the previous data triangulation step. From our data triangulation activities, we were able to understand the specific challenges, successes, and most importantly, areas for improvement that were facing the 115 HIV clinics. Based on the data, we identified more than 15 relevant resources to present and disseminate to the providers to improve practice and ultimately patient outcomes. The disseminated resources are listed here on the side, and I will ask Mike to advance the animations to showcase some of the resources. We'd like to highlight that all of these resources were either already created by the health department or were free downloads from different organizations. Then we, a team of 6 public health professionals, package these resources along with the individualized clinic reports into folders and set out for in-person detailing visits at HIV clinics across New York City. It's important to note that while we identified more than 15 resources for dissemination, we decided based on the data to focus our detailing on 4 HIV priority initiatives, which I will discuss more on the next slide. Step 3 of the data to detailing approach entails the actual detailing. For us, we branded this detailing campaign Ending of the Epidemic Technical Assistance Visits, or ETETA visits for short. Based on the core elements of detailing, these visits included an introduction and review of data, specifically the individualized clinic report shown previously, a needs assessment focused on 4 HIV priority initiatives, which included undetectable equals untransmittable, immediate ART, substance use, and HIV and aging. The visits also included dissemination of key messages and supportive resources related to the 4 HIV priority initiatives and identification of additional detailing needs. Clinics' responses to the needs assessment questions and key messages, as well as the identification of additional detailing needs, were documented on a paper tool. I will ask Mike to advance the 3 animations so you can get an idea of what the tools look like. We transferred the data from this paper tool into a database so we could easily use it for subsequent detailing efforts. Next slide, please. Step 4 of the data to detailing approach is evaluation. The evaluation of our detailing work is crucial to understand the impact it has on providers and how to improve our strategy for future detailing projects. We completed 59 ETETA visits covering 101 primary care sites, which are represented in the map featured to the right as green check marks. An anonymous evaluation survey was sent individually to all attendees approximately 20 to 30 days after the detailing visit. The evaluation assessed overall satisfaction and utility of the detailing visit and the resources shared, and improved awareness and capacity among providers to improve viral load suppression among people with HIV. Next slide, please. 69 respondents out of 204 clinical and non-clinical detailed providers completed the evaluation, which is approximately a 34% response rate. While the evaluation response rate was low, the results were promising. Over 90% of respondents strongly agreed or agreed that the ETETA visits increased individual awareness about both initiatives and resources designed to improve viral load suppression. 74% of respondents strongly agreed or agreed that the ETETA visits increased individual capacity to improve viral load suppression among people with HIV. 76% of respondents strongly agreed or agreed that the ETETA visits increased team capacity to improve viral load suppression among people with HIV. And 92% of respondents strongly agreed or agreed that the ETETA visits encouraged HIV clinic staff to reach out to CODA in the future for additional support in improving viral load suppression among people with HIV. Our main takeaway from the evaluation data was that this data to detailing approach was effective in establishing relationships and increasing capacity of the HIV clinic and non-clinical providers to improve viral load suppression among people with HIV. Thus, we have recently adapted this approach for a new priority area, immediate antiretroviral treatment, or IART, which I will elaborate on the next few slides. So now I'll be presenting on how our program adapted this data to detailing approach for a new public health detailing campaign focused on IART. So before we get into how we've replicated the approach, we'd like to highlight that in New York State, IART is defined as initiation of ART, preferably on the same day or within 96 hours prior to any confirmation, baseline, or resistance testing to all individuals who are candidates for immediate initiation. Given the strong evidence indicating the benefits of IART at the individual and population level, New York State's clinical guidelines have been updated to reflect IART as the new standard of care for HIV treatment. Next slide, please. Like our first detailing campaign, the IART detailing campaign has been following the same approach as data triangulation, detailing preparation and execution, and evaluation. Next slide, please. For step 1, data triangulation, we compiled the ETETA detailing data with other available data from a citywide IART knowledge, attitude, and practice provider survey, as well as anecdotes from providers that were implementing new IART programs. Through this data triangulation, we developed a more comprehensive understanding of the most common IART implementation challenges, which included 1, clear guidance for rapid HIV testing, 2, insurance coverage and access to same-day ART, 3, initiating ART prior to genotype test results, and 4, changing clinic workflow. This step was critical for our next step, which is detailing preparation. So for step 3, detailing preparation, namely the selection of tailored resources, we identified over 10 existing resources that could address the common IART implementation challenges. In addition, we developed 4 new resources to specifically address HIV testing, clinical operations, access to same-day ART, and genotype resistance testing as it relates to IART. Mike, can you please advance the 4 animations so you can see the new resources? As you can see, these resources have been formatted to be brief and provide clear guidance to support providers' implementation of IART. Next slide, please. So step 3 brings us to our actual detailing. So during COVID-19, rather than relying on our traditional approach of in-person detailing visits, we must adopt virtual approaches, including electronic detailing or e-detailing. E-detailing is based on the core elements and theory of traditional in-person detailing, but uses interactive virtual platforms to engage providers. Starting next month, CODA will use e-detailing to promote IART and disseminate IART public health detailing action kits among clinical and non-clinical providers. We'd like to highlight that given our strong commitment to establishing and growing relationships with providers, we will not be contracting detailers to implement the e-detailing visits. We, as a small but committed team of currently only 2 people, will be conducting the e-detailing visits ourselves. So that brings us to the last slide of our presentation, which outlines our next steps for IART e-detailing. Next slide, please. In December 2020, we will begin IART e-detailing, which will be conducted via video conferences. Once we schedule a visit, we will ask all attendees to complete a baseline survey before the actual visit. During the e-detailing visit, we will present IART key messages and the implementation resources. After the e-detailing visit, we will ask providers to complete a post-visit survey at 3 and 6 months to ensure that we provide additional support if needed, and so that we can complete the final step in our data to detailing approach evaluation. Next slide, please. Thank you so much for your attention. We hope that it was helpful to hear our approach and how we've changed our approach due to the available resources and the ever-changing work environment due to the impacts of COVID-19. Mine and Erica's emails are provided on the slide in case you'd like to follow up after the conference with any questions. Thanks again.
Fantastic. Thank you, Julianne, and thank you for stepping in to carry the ball for both of you. But really, we do want to thank the 2 of you together. Just a quick housekeeping for everyone on the call. We'll go, since there isn't a break involved, we'll go a little bit past 1:30 before we segue into the next planned session, and that will be so that we can make sure that we have enough time to hear from the next presentation from Christopher Stoyanovsky. He's an evaluation specialist at the San Francisco Department of Public Health. We've been lucky enough to get to know him at the HIV PrEP institutes that we've had out there. He's also a PhD candidate in public health at the University of Michigan, is trained in a wide range of methods in evaluating health interventions and outcomes, and has been particularly interested in evaluating implementation of evidence-based and community-based strategies and interventions. He's going to talk to us about some of the lessons learned from the work that we've all been doing in San Francisco together. So Christopher, very excited to hear from you.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for advancing the slides, everyone. So just disclosures, just to let everyone know, in San Francisco, the project is funded by the CDC regarding Project Pride, which is where PrEP detailing came out of, kind of things here. And then I am paid as an external and independent evaluator for the West Coast. I am going to try to move a little quicker just to make up for some time.
And Christopher, do not worry, because that is absolutely okay. We can go to 1:35, so don't rush yourself. We can make this work.
Awesome, thanks, Devin.
Sure.
So for the agenda, just a quick rundown of a background. I'm going to get into some evaluation definitions and tools to kind of frame what evaluation is, or at least the way I think about evaluation. Learnings from what we got in San Francisco, evaluating the detailing efforts, and then open it up for discussion and questions. Next slide, please. Right. So what is evaluation to folks? If you want to throw things in chat, feel free. But so I recognize it can mean a lot of different things. And a lot of folks like to think of it as recognizing whether or not a program or policy or public health practice is achieving the goals it's trying to get to. I would add a little bit more to it in that it's a systematic process of learning and unlearning in order to improve and refine ways that we conduct public health detailing and the tools that we use.
So it looks like we have a poll here, Christopher. We
Yeah.
can actually ask people what they think the purpose of evaluation is. So
Great.
folks, if you can pop on over to your poll everywhere and share a word or two, what's the purpose of evaluation? Thanks for kicking us off with improvement, measuring results, reporting to funding, I'm sure, telling your story, showing success, assessing goals. Did it work? Of course, quality control, measurement, learn if it's working, feedback, reporting, and determining shortcomings. All looks right. What do you think, Christopher?
These are all lovely. And I like the one about telling your story. And that's definitely the framework I take with evaluation work. So thanks everyone for doing that. So as folks mentioned in the poll everywhere, evaluation helps understand what is working and what doesn't work, right? It provides information on how processes are unfolding and then helps shape whether or not we need to change said processes. It improves the impactful stewardship of resources, like someone mentioned, funding, right? And then demonstrates our program outcomes and impact. Next slide, please. Thanks. So these are kind of different stages and types of evaluation. And I put this slide in here because I think it's particularly important that as you move from left to right, you try to get more understanding of the ultimate impact and kind of how is it shaping the outcomes that we're trying to get at. However, when we're talking about detailing, those are much longer term goals that may not happen in a 12-month period. It might not happen in an 18-month period, but it might be something that occurs long after a detailing program is even finished, hopefully if providers are continuing to still use what they've learned during detailing. So then how do we measure a program that is trying to achieve these systems level changes, knowing very well that it's not going to fit in a 12-month grant cycle, it's not going to fit in a 2-year grant cycle, but rather is a much more longer term. So then what are the things that we can talk about and evaluate that are kind of intermediary or during the unfolding of detailing, which is where I live, which is the kind of process and outcome evaluation. So to help kind of define or put together like what we're trying to measure is through I use logic models. I don't know if folks have used these before, but they're a big tool in evaluation that really tries to understand what am I putting into this program. So those are my inputs. So things like palm cards, right, for doctors, kind of all the resources that we just saw New York providing to their providers, right? So then what are the activities we're conducting? So these face-to-face detailing visits, right? I'm trying to, or even e-detailing at this point. E-detailing now, what are the outputs of that work? So those are things like that are trying to quantify who I've reached, how many people have I detailed, how many palm cards have I disseminated, and then we start to get to the outcomes and impacts. So this is measuring the change. So did I increase skills? Did I increase providers' ability to conduct sexual health histories? Have I changed prescribing behaviors? But those questions require some really robust data. And so I want to now get into a little bit of what we did in San Francisco. So during the CDC Project Pride, San Francisco decided to pilot a PrEP detailing program. However, right at the beginning, they recognized that like sexual health history taking was a key pathway to PrEP. Having discussions about sex was like what needed to happen with providers. That wasn't happening. So there was a big pivot in San Francisco right at the onset when they started learning all this to start focusing more a little bit more on sexual health and not just PrEP. The goal was still to increase uptake of PrEP among key populations. And so as part of the project period, but as I mentioned, right, it was way more bigger than just PrEP prescribing. It was what are providers doing or not doing that gets us to the pathway related to PrEP prescribing. So next slide, please. Thanks. So in San Francisco, there was 2 different models that we used. One was a nurse practitioner over a long term, and then San Francisco also wanted to see whether or not a consultant-based model was going to work, similar to what was happening in Los Angeles and New York. And so they gave it an initial 7-week period. What ended up happening was the consultant model ended up having substantial challenges getting into providers' offices because they weren't considered a Department of Public Health employee. So policy restrictions to representatives really hindered the ability of the consultant-based model to access clinics. And then at San Francisco reprioritized the nurse practitioner program or detailing efforts versus the consultant one. So the goal of it was to support clinical practice change. And then there was a ton of materials developed similar to that in New York, and other jurisdictions like LA, so self-collection posters for STI, palm cards for HIV testing. All these were provided to the provider and to the clinics themselves. So this is a poll everywhere question. Am I mistaken? Is it? I think it should be.
Not just yet. I think it is coming up
Fair.
next. Yes.
And so what do we need to evaluate and learn? As Dawn had mentioned, data is really, really important, right? And, but it's more than just surveys. It's really understanding the process of detailing. What is unfolding? Who am I reaching? Who am I not reaching? Why am I not reaching them? And then what are the processes that I'm utilizing and how are we tracking those things, right? So here's the poll. Yeah, what kind of data?
It looks like people are responding with a boatload of things, trying to measure PrEP prescriptions, provider demographics, prescribing habits, knowledge, comfort, satisfaction, patient needs, self-reported intent to change behavior, attitude, all that good stuff. Does this sound like the kind of stuff that you would encourage collecting? Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
great.
And even particularly fascinating, and we can get into in the discussion section about how some, the challenges of collecting certain kinds of data, like prescribing data. Where do we get that from? Great. So thinking about detailing and data collection, they really go hand in hand. It's really what we're all doing during detailing that is important to be measured and collected as data. It's not just prescribing, right? It's not just intentions to prescribe, but it's really all the heavy lifting behind the ultimate goal of changing providers' behaviors. And so all of this becomes data. And so one of the ways I've been thinking about evaluation of detailing work is how do we use the tools that we already have that we're using as part of our detailing efforts to also let them serve as data collection tools as well. So how do we not have to kind of reinvent the wheel, but how do we use what we're already doing as sources of data to then also evaluate detailing? Thanks for going to the next slide. And so thinking about detailing, and what we've heard from earlier and from discussions is that detailing is longitudinal, right? We're constantly having conversations with providers, ultimately trying to change their behaviors. So the fact that this is a longitudinal effort, we should leverage that, and which is a huge benefit for evaluation of detailing, so we can actually measure impact, which requires, just from a statistical methodology standpoint, it requires time for us to actually assess whether these things are having causal effects. One of the other things I've noticed too in evaluation of this work is tracking the conversations that detailers have with their providers. That itself, those conversations are data points that can be leveraged to evaluate what is happening. So what was discussed at the first visit versus later visit? How are my conversations changing over time? What did we talk about, let's say, in the first couple months versus months 6 and 7, where I've been able to work with you more and change practices? And then thinking about, like, what are the issues that are arising for providers over time? And with detailing as a public health practice, ultimately we're hoping to change behavior, right? So that would mean that providers' needs should also be changing over time. as detailing efforts continue and move forward. So in San Francisco, there was a whole bunch of tools that were developed to help us kind of evaluate and study what was happening with detailing. So one of them, which I thought was, been really helpful as I'm actually revising the paper right now, is Excel tracking sheets. So these things included dates and times of visits for these clinics that we're reaching out to. And then it had lovely columns that was like, okay, follow-up visit 1, follow-up visit 2. And these were all dates that we could include and then understand, okay, how many months or days was it before detailing visit? Did I even get to these providers a second time? And then also kind of geography of providers to understand who am I reaching and who am I not reaching. We also had detailing logs, which you'll see. Thank you for going to this one. So if you look on the left, the daily visit log, one of the nurse practitioner detailer would fill these out when they would do their detailing visits with just really brief notes, but maybe like a couple minutes of what were their perceptions of that detailing visit with that clinic, what took place, what additional follow-up needs to happen. And we used these as data sources to we read these and kind of looked at, what are the notes that detailers are taking regarding their visits? What are they talking about? What are providers not talking about? And then we also, to add a little bit more context, we also did some interviews with providers and detailers themselves as well. And so I'll get into a little bit more specifics. Thanks for putting all these up. So in our data collection procedures in San Francisco, we did have a 10-question survey. Unfortunately, with the way detailing unfolded in San Francisco, it was hard to collect follow-up post-survey data in San Francisco. One of the things that we noticed that was happening during the evaluation was there was a lot of group detailing happening and not one-on-one detailing, which made collecting and then kind of putting together and tracking these providers at time 1 versus time 2 versus time 3, it made that way more difficult to do in a group detailing setting. And so kind of just thinking about the theory of change for detailing, the one-on-one approach is not only really helpful from a detailing perspective, but also extremely important from an evaluation perspective as well. And so we also then did some interviews with 5 of the 6 detailers in San Francisco who were working on getting to zero initiatives. So this is rapid HIV treatment, PrEP, hepatitis C, opioids. And so it was, we kind of had conversations with all the detailers to learn about what was happening. And then we also did some interviews with providers to discuss kind of what took place, how do they feel about it? And then particularly, we talked to providers who had more than one visit to see kind of what conversations looked like over time. And then, as I mentioned, the detailer logs. Next slide, thank you. So the main themes that kind of came out of our data from San Francisco were in 4 big buckets. We wanted to make sure that providers and detailers really understood the purpose of detailing, and were they talking about it the same way, or was it different? So I'll get into that. And then we also looked at what were the benefits that came out of detailing? How did prescribers view detailing? What did they change, or if anything, in their behaviors, or how did it improve their clinical processes? And then we looked at some challenges and facilitators to actually conducting detailing itself, and then some strategies or ways to improve detailing that were provided by the providers and detailers. So I'm not going to read all these quotes, but I did want to just uplift some of the main takeaways that we understood. One is that providers and detailers definitely spoke about this in the same way. So that was great. There was alignment between the detailing strategy and what providers were taking away from detailing. And so if you look at kind of the quote in the middle that provider said, when detailing is an opportunity for me as a primary care physician to learn about what San Francisco can offer as support. And then also, as provider 1 noted, sharing best practices for sexual health. And so providers definitely recognize that detailing was instrumental in helping connect them to resources and information that they didn't have before. Some of the benefits of detailing, one of the big ones that came out was this concept of building confidence of providers, which we've alluded to and mentioned before. As Dawn mentioned, right, providers are critical juncture points for achieving our HIV getting to zero plans nationally and also locally. And so one of the providers in our detailing evaluation, just mentioned, it gave me the confidence to talk about anal sex. These are things that we've been talking about during this little conference about, things that doctors don't feel comfortable with or need additional kind of training and health education around. The same provider also then mentioned that they were now screening for STIs more than they were before. And then as you see in provider 6, they had no clue that doing just urine catches was not helpful it was missing all these other STIs and oral and anal STIs that they had no clue that they were actually missing by just doing urine catches. So thinking about the challenges with detailing, the consultant one had particular barriers, given that it was like a 7-week time limited campaign. So it didn't allow for enough time for the consultant to actually make inroads in the clinics and connect with providers in ways that would produce meaningful change. And then as provider 1 noted, talking about needing time to actually make change to their practices and policies. And so then detailing becomes an important point, as Dawn mentioned. How do we work with providers in this longitudinal way to support those practice and policy changes that need to be made? And so that became a big factor that kind of arose out of our evaluation. And then last one, the big ones that kind of came out of this improvement piece was, how do we support providers in the moment that they are providing clinical care? What are the tools that we use? What do those look like? And providers definitely talked a lot about wanting simple materials that they could quickly reference in the moment that this patient is in the room with them, to then know what they need to do in terms of STI screening or HIV testing, and then also PrEP prescribing. And then also just a bigger, higher level kind of picture was, how do we leverage these connections with the Department of Public Health better, and also between the clinics that have been detailed? There was a conversation among providers of like, how do we become a community of kind of change makers in practice that is kind of advancing sexual health in the city, and how do we leverage each other's kind of resources and efforts in a more holistic kind of way? I know that was pretty fast, but those are the stories that came out.
Thank you so much, Christopher. We so appreciate it. And I'm sure everybody is wondering exactly what our plan is to make up some time here. We're going to take one question for each presenter, and then any further questions for this presenter, we're actually going to create a special thread under our HIV arm of the discussion forum. And so that's something where if you have extra questions for Dawn, Julianne, and Erica, or Christopher, or all four, we can have them there and triage them to all of the presenters. But I have been keeping my eye on the chat box, and I do promise the global panel we will keep you on time and make sure everyone still has their afternoon break, because it's critical. So we won't eat into any of your time. In the meantime, a question that came up, and there was quite some chat, Dawn, was when you're looking at data and you're trying to understand what the prevalence is of folks who are at high risk for acquiring HIV, or may already potentially have it and not know it. How can data sources attempt to be non-binary when looking at gender? We had a lot of folks ask, is it really critical to understand whether partners are either, cis, men or women, or if there are questions being asked more and more to collect information about transgender folks. So I'm going to turn that over to you to share your thoughts on.
Okay, so this is a very difficult topic because we're trying to reach primary care docs who are not already engaged in HIV care. I think for people who are in the HIV arena, there's a great deal of comfort with asking about transgender issues, and there's a great awareness of why that may be relevant to clinical care. But thinking about, you know, providers in rural Georgia where there's a lot of HIV infection, but where they don't think they're seeing, they're not really sure what transgender is, and they're not really sure that they have a transgender patient, wanting to be able to give them an entryway into PrEP. Then the idea is that as they get more familiar with it, then you can bring up these special cases. Well, what do I do if somebody's pregnant? Well, what do I do if somebody's transgender? Well, what if I do, you know, but in the overall question for everybody, we did not want to get that specific. So if I ask whether you have sex with men, women, or both, a couple things can happen. Number one is if you know that one of your partners is transgender, you can volunteer that information. The second thing is if I'm not really sure, if I think of them as men, even though they're transgender men, then I'm going to answer, yes, I have sex with men. So it's kind of an open question that allows people to find their own way into the conversation. Does that make sense?
That's a great way to frame it. It is, and it is, of course, not something we can answer with, you know, just one answer. And I like that you identified that it is complex. For folks who have more questions about that, feel free to email Dawn, or you can email us and we'll make sure it gets over to her. Thanks so much, Dawn, and thanks for your great presentation. I know we did have a question, Julianne, from Teresa Grund about the free report program you use. Can you remind us what it's called and whether or not you recommend it?
Sure. We use Canva. It's called Canva, and they have all these different great free template reports that you can access online.
Excellent. Yeah, people have been talking a lot about Canva over the past 3 days. Pick-to-Chart works well too, and as Julianne mentioned, the first account you can create is a sort of a basic free account, and then you can upgrade. Great. Any questions for Christopher? I know that he had to pack a lot of info into a very short amount of time, but evaluation is always something we have so many questions about. If I don't see a question in the next little bit, Christopher, I'm going to kind of throw it over to you for something a little more general. Would you say, I know there's always questions about qualitative and quantitative, and you brought up how important quantitative data is. Wondering if you could share your thoughts about sort of the best way to make qualitative data impactful, especially in this particular clinical topic, this setting, because I think a lot of folks have a challenge figuring out how to grab the sound bites that are most compelling when there's so much narrative data. So if I can throw you on the spot to speak a little to that, that would be great. Oh, and we have you muted.
Yeah, sorry.
Yep, there we go.
Yeah. I appreciate this question. One of the things, just I'll start it off with, it's definitely not an or situation, it's an and situation. Like having both quantitative and qualitative data is what will tell a story. If I were just to give statistics to people and say, look, we achieved PrEP prescribing numbers that increased, that's cool, but how did we do that? Like what happened to get us to that number? What have providers said? I think an interesting one, a quote came out of one of our detailers that said, that was doing rapid HIV care, so under 5 days. And she said, the deal was struck the first time I had a provider actually do their first rapid HIV treatment process. And I was like, whoa, that is like a story that needs to be told everywhere. Once the provider feels confidence in doing that activity and that behavior, getting them to continue doing that behavior and bringing others along into that space becomes easier. And so, I mean, that's the way I would frame that. And there's just so much power in a story in qualitative data that it just doesn't come out of quantitative data. And so I love the use of both to better support each other and get a holistic understanding.
I love that so much, and it sounds like they really do kind of make a 1-2 punch, and that you can take qualitative to really underscore, kind of underline the key pieces of your quantitative data. Again, thank you all so much, Don, Julianne, and Christopher, for really kind of showing us the arc of what are providers up against, what do they know, what do they need to know, how have some AD implementation attempts been successful and what has been learned, and then how do you take what you're doing in the field and try to figure out if it's working. This has been a great panel, and those of you who still have questions lingering, pop them over to us. We'll be happy to triage them. What we'll be doing now is transitioning to our global panel. I know we've been really excited to take this on, and we'll make sure that we do tidy up just in time over the next hour so that you all can stretch at 2:45 Eastern Standard Time. I am delighted to introduce our very first speaker, who is a fan favorite here at NaRCAD. It's Harold Langes, the director of COOP, the Norwegian Academic Detailing Program in Trondheim, Norway. And he is exploring a question that is ages old about academic detailing. Should it always be one-to-one? Some folks have really found that trying different approaches works. Some other folks, and sometimes us here at NaRCAD, become sticklers for not calling it AD unless it is one-to-one, but we're always open to the nuance, and we're excited to see what Harold has learned and what he can share. So Harold, over to you.
Thank you, Bevin, and good evening, everyone. First, let me thank the NaRCAD team for organizing this virtual conference and for giving me the opportunity to present some of the academic detailing work we have been doing in Norway. This conference has always been very helpful for us, and I really hope that we will be able to meet back in Boston next year.
Or maybe we'll come to Norway.
Yeah, you're welcome. So I have no conflicts of interest to declare. Our academic detailing program and all the other work I'm involved in is financed from the Norwegian government, and we do not take any money from other sources.
All right, so we have a poll question here, and I know that you would like to read it, so I will pop over to that. It is a yes, no, just as effective or unsure question, so go for it, Harold.
Yeah, perfect. So I would just like to ask you a quick question. Do you believe that one-to-one academic detailing is more effective than group meetings? And that is for changing prescribing behavior, of course. So, okay.
Looks like we have some hardcore one-to-one folks here. Some people saying just as effective and unsure, and a very small percentage saying no. We can let folks keep on responding, but really looking forward to seeing what is the truth here. All right, we've got about 50% saying yes. Let's move on and see what your thoughts are, Harold.
Yeah, thank you. So from Jerry Evans' first papers, academic detailing has always been about the one-to-one interaction and the importance of handling each single prescriber's beliefs and needs individually. When we started the first academic detailing work in Norway in 2015, we used the one-to-one approach as a way of separating us from other kinds of educational initiatives. Prescribers are used to receiving updates in group sessions, and the one-to-one meetings was something new that both prescribers and others were unfamiliar with. So it gave us a lot of attention, but it also raised quite a lot of questions. So when we first were trying to make appointments with prescribers, we often met the same response as I would suspect many of you have. Why can't you just do it in a group, and preferably during lunch? So our approach has always been to stick with the idea of academic detailing being one-to-one. The reason for this has been because this is the origin of academic detailing, and most important, that's where the effect of the intervention is documented. And also to add, it's of course because it was something new. So we got a lot of attention when we started doing one-to-one visits in Norway. So why did we choose to do a randomized controlled study? Doing an RCT is a very rigorous process. And I guess the simple answer is because we could. We had the materials ready and we were going to visit those prescribers anyway. So we thought that it wouldn't be that much extra work to organize the visits as an RCT. And by telling you that, you will all understand that none of us had ever done an RCT before, because obviously it will be a lot of extra work. Hopefully it will be worth it. There is a lack of published data on the effectiveness of academic detailing compared to group meetings. Only a few papers published have looked into this, and results are not conclusive. So we hope that our work can contribute to the knowledge about this. Another aspect is that for an organization as ours, working to get more money from the government to finance our work, it is important to evaluate and document the effect of the work that we do. And I think doing a high quality study is probably the best way to do that. So the campaign we were working on at the time was type 2 diabetes in primary care. Even though this is a subject where we would not expect quick and easy changes in prescribing, we decided to go on with it. After all, academic detailing should be a suitable intervention for complex subjects like this. In Norway, we have a national prescription database, so we decided to use that for evaluation. We will be looking at prescription data 12 months before and after the intervention. And we are looking at all anti-diabetic and relevant cardiovascular drugs to see if we can identify changes in prescribing. Unfortunately, we don't have any results from this analysis yet. I was hoping to maybe give you some of that, but we are working on a publication for next year, hopefully.
And Christopher also wants to tell you he's jealous of your data from one evaluator to another evaluator. All right, back to you.
So we decided to do this study in central Norway, since this is the area that we cover from our group here in Trondheim. And we included all communities with at least 3 general practitioners in the study. There's actually a lot of smaller communities here with 1 and 2 GPs. But the reason for excluding those small communities is, of course, that it would not be possible to do group visits in smaller offices. And the GPs were randomized at the community level before they were asked to receive a visit and to participate in the study. All the offices that were visited had previously been offered 1 or 2 academic detailing visits. My estimate is that about 75% of the GPs would have received at least 1 academic detailing visit previously. And maybe a third of those would have received 2 visits. So the participants were mostly familiar with academic detailing, but this was still a new concept to them, while all of the GPs will be very familiar with having education in group meetings. And as you can see, we had a great success in recruiting participants. More than 90% of all invited GPs received a visit in both intervention groups. The one-to-one meetings were done as our usual academic detailing. And for the group meetings, we prepared a PowerPoint presentation with the same information as in the brochure we used for the one-to-one meetings. And the group meetings were done as a presentation with a Q&A session in the end. And as you can see, each group meeting took almost twice as long as the one-to-one visits, 46 minutes compared to 26 minutes. And this is, of course, of importance because every GP would invest more time doing group meetings compared to one-to-one visits. So in lack of results from the prescription data, I can show you some of the results from the electronic evaluation that was sent out after each visit. 56% of those who had a one-to-one visit and 63% of those who had group visits responded. The results were generally very similar between study groups. As you can see, about 2/3 said that they would change practice to some degree, and 15% in both study groups reported a larger change. So hopefully we will see some change in the prescription data. A very high proportion in both groups said that they would accept another visit on a different therapeutic area. This is a question that we have been asking since we first started doing academic detailing, and the results have been similar through all the campaigns we have done. The results reflect a very positive way that the GPs welcome us, and this is one of the biggest motivations we have to keep working with academic detailing in Norway. So this was the only question where there was a substantial difference between study groups. As you can see, those who received a one-to-one visit would prefer the same in the future, and those who had a group visit would prefer that. But this trend was much stronger among those who had a group visit. And it's difficult to explain why so many GPs in this study seems to prefer group meetings. One obvious explanation could be that it actually is better than meeting one-to-one, although as academic detailers, that is hard to believe. One possible explanation is that GPs are used to group meetings and that this is a setting that they are comfortable in. They are in a safe environment with colleagues they know and trust, and having an outside visitor may be less threatening. I also think that there may be a common opinion that group meetings are more time efficient, even though, as we have seen, this is wrong, at least from the GP's perspective. And even though most of the GPs we visited had experienced one-to-one detailing previously, this was still something new for them. We know that many prescribers are afraid that we are coming to check their practice or to check their knowledge, and that meeting a stranger with maybe superior knowledge about the subject might be intimidating, even for a well-trained physician. And I believe that it will take more than a few visits for the GPs to really understand what academic detailing is about and to be comfortable in that setting. I also think that we need to work with the skills of the detailers to make sure that there actually is an open discussion during the one-to-one meetings. In this morning's expert panel, Mary-Liz said that it may be easier to give a presentation than to detail. And I think that may be true. There is a risk that the detailers fall into what you can call presentation mode during the detailing, both because they are familiar with giving presentations, but also because that may feel safer than engaging in an open discussion about clinical issues. At least for us, many of us who are doing the visits don't have much clinical experience, even though we are trained pharmacists and physicians. We mostly don't see any patients. When you end up giving a presentation during the visits, that's not a very effective detailing visit. Next slide, please. Thank you. So our experience with group meetings were quite predictable. Trying to gather busy GPs in an office will always be challenging. Some are running late with patients and some have issues to discuss with a colleague. In a one-to-one meeting, we only have to wait for that one prescriber. And I think it's likely that they will feel more responsible to avoid delays than for a group meeting. And with several GPs in the room, there will always be disturbances. Some are arriving late, some are leaving early, and there is always disturbances from phones and office personnel. It can be challenging for the visitor to handle all those disturbances. And it's not, please go back. Thank you. It's not possible to apply the main concepts of academic detailing in group meetings, of course. Identifying each prescriber's beliefs and needs and having an open discussion based on this is not possible in a group. And if there are dominant persons in the group, this may be a barrier for others to ask questions or to share their experiences. But let's not forget that groups can have a very positive dynamic too. In a group where the different prescribers know and trust each other, and there is no one too dominating in the group, we see that colleagues share experiences with each other, and that more experienced prescribers give counsel to the more junior physicians. As a visitor, it is very satisfying when one of the prescribers confirm your key messages and give their full support to your message in front of their colleagues. This will probably also add to the impact you have as a detailer, and is something that is hard to achieve in a one-to-one meeting. So the detailers, including myself, on the other hand, we were very enthusiastic about meeting one-to-one. All trained detailers have, of course, learned that this is the best way, so we are biased. But I still think that this is an important finding, and it may reflect that there is more room for discussions and more relaxed environment in a meeting between only two persons. In a paper we published last year, we tried to summarize the advantages and disadvantages with one-to-one meetings and group meetings. This overview was partly based on findings from literature and partly from our own experiences. For one-to-one or academic detailing, as we simply call it here, one major advantage is that it is time effective for the prescriber. In our experience, doing a group session takes about twice the time as a one-to-one meeting. So that means that every prescriber has to invest more time in group meetings. One-to-one meetings is also more flexible, so the visit can start as soon as the prescriber is ready, without having to wait for colleagues. And of course, the basis of academic detailing is to tailor the messages to the individual prescriber's current understanding and behavior. On the disadvantage side, one-to-one meetings can be time-consuming for the visitor. For many well-organized offices, there is little or no waiting between visiting the individual prescribers. But nevertheless, it is more time-consuming to visit prescribers individually, even though every visit is quicker than a group session. For group meetings, there is time to save for the visitor, but then again at the expense of prescribers. We know that it is hard to keep focus in a group, both because it may feel less committing, but also because it takes longer. And I think the main advantage for group meetings is that some groups have a good dynamic and that it is possible to create an arena where prescribers can learn from each other. I think this may have as a high impact as academic detailing in some cases. The risk is, of course, that you end up in a group with bad dynamics and a very dominant person who ruins this possibility. And in my experience, there will always be disturbances that interfere with the progress of the meeting. So, to conclude, both group meetings and one-to-one academic detailing may be valuable methods for educational outreach. They have different advantages and disadvantages and may be suitable for different subjects. We will soon begin to analyze the prescription data from our RCT. Hopefully, our results will add more to the knowledge about the academic detailing in group meetings. And I'm very excited to see if the results will match the polling results from the beginning of my presentation. So thank you, and I will be happy to take questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Harold. Always a pleasure to have you present. And I know that folks have been making a lot of comments in the chat box. Actually, Christopher from the last presentation said, I think the group advantages findings about sharing learning among attendees is fascinating, especially with providers in San Francisco wanting to create a sense of community. So it sounds like Christopher is also bringing in the fact that what's going on in the culture of your community is particularly relevant. We have Trish Ron from the Center for Effective Practice in Ontario, Canada. What's your personal feeling, Harold, on whether one-to-one or group is better? And what role, if any, do you see for group visits? And Paul, I know we have a question from you on deck.
Well, I will try to be open-minded before we start to look into the data, but you would suspect that one-to-one is more efficient, but I think that, as I was telling you about, some of the group meetings may be very helpful. And I think maybe for some interventions, group meetings can be a good alternative to one-to-one detailing as well. So, yeah.
being that democratic as always. Harold, we have a question here from Paul Fenikos at Alosa. He wants to know, was there a limit on the group size, or were you kind of open to whatever size the group would be? That's his question to start. And then he also wants to know, on top of that, will impact be evaluated by size if there's change between sizes of the group?
Yes, we did not have a limit for the groups. I think the biggest group we visited was 11, but most groups were between 3 and 7. And we are not going to look into different sizes of the group sizes, no.
Okay, okay. Good to know. I know we have a question from Jerry Avorn that he wants to be unmuted to ask. So Anna, let's pop on over to Jerry and unmute him so he can respond to the presentation. Jerry, what are your thoughts that you wanted to share?
Carol, thank you very much. And we're always interested in seeing what our Norwegian colleagues are doing. I wanted to follow up on Paul Fenikos's point that whereas we know how many people are in a one-to-one interaction, it's hard to know whether a group of like 2 or 3 would be different from a group of 10 to 15. And so as you look through this, to the extent that that's knowable, that would be of interest. And you're aware, I think, of this work that I did with Martien van Eyck in the Netherlands in the 90s. I think it was in BMJ, where we did try to randomize between group and individual. And it did seem that while group worked, it worked not as well as one-on-one. And so that I'm sure is entering into your looking at sort of what is known, what is not known. But once this is out, it'll be a really interesting piece of the literature that you'll be adding. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think at this point, I know we have a couple more questions, but I want to be respectful of our time. I think at this stage, if you have further questions for Harold, I know he's always generously more than happy to offer his time. So do feel free to either email him directly, we will have a contact list up, or you can email us at narcad@partners.org and we will make sure to get it over to him. Thank you so much, Harold, for kicking off our global panel this year. We appreciate it. All right, so next up, we are very excited to have a classic dynamic duo who have been lovely enough to join us for quite a few sessions now. And we're always really happy to have them join us. They offer a lot of great perspective from the North. So visiting us from Canada virtually, I am pleased to present Lindsay Bevan and Victoria Burton from the Centre for Effective Practice in Ontario, Canada. They work closely together with Lindsay as the project manager up there and also as part of the primary care academic detailing service. And Victoria is the project coordinator for that same program. Happy to hear the spectrum of how they handled many different topics across supporting primary care during the pandemic. So over to you, Lindsay and Victoria, and thanks for being with us today. We're really excited to see you.
Thanks, Bevan. We're really excited to be here again, although we wish it could be in person. As Bevan mentioned, I'm Victoria, and presenting with me today is Lindsay. We're both employees of the Centre for Effective Practice, and we have no other conflicts. And our primary care academic detailing service in Ontario is funded by the Ontario Ministry of Health. So to kick us off, I want to take you all back to a much simpler time, February of 2020. Over the past 3 years since the launch of our service, our detailers had visited physicians in Ontario on 4 pretty heavy topics around opioids and chronic pain and benzodiazepine use in older adults. In addition to realizing some positive changes to prescribing behavior, we saw immense physician satisfaction and support for the service. And due to these positive results, we had just received funding to continue the service for 2 more years. We were really looking forward to moving on to a lighter topic, PPI use in older adults. But then COVID-19 came to Ontario and we were forced to pivot to support physicians through the pandemic. So today, we're going to discuss the various strategies that we've implemented since the inception of our service to support its sustainability. And then we're going to narrow in on how we had to pivot due to COVID-19 and how that really forced us to add another strategy to our wheelhouse.
So I'll start by saying that we're by no means experts in program sustainability. But as Victoria mentioned, we just want to share with you a few things that we feel have really helped keep our academic detailing service here in Ontario afloat. And by us, I mean our whole team at CAP, because this work is a product of everybody's hard work. So we're just on the 4th slide. So yeah, that one's perfect. Oh, back one.
Sorry about that. I hit my mouse.
That's okay. Yeah, this one's perfect. Thanks. Okay, so the first thing we wanted to share, because we feel like it's worked really well for us, is aligning our visit topics with the latest challenge that's facing the providers that we serve, to be able to demonstrate to our funders that our service can be a solution to address those challenges. So some of these challenges are easier to identify. An example would be the opioid crisis, which informed our opioid chronic pain visits. And others require more active needs assessment work to be able to identify, like our benzodiazepine use in older adults topic, which requires surveying primary care providers to understand their needs and looking at publicly available data to determine if we can see any potentially inappropriate or costly prescribing areas or areas with increasing prevalence. But overall, focusing on that latest challenge has really helped us ensure that when we're meeting with our funders to discuss our service progress or request additional funding, that we're talking about a topic that's already top of mind for them. Another strategy that's worked really well for us is positioning those topics and the evaluation results from them to align with our funders' priorities to make sure that we're demonstrating value where it counts. So once we've actually chosen a topic to detail on, we ensure that when we're discussing that topic with our funders, we're highlighting the aspects of it that best align with our funders' priorities. So I'll give you an example, our benzodiazepine use in older adults topic. That can be positioned as a patient safety topic, and it can also be positioned as a saving costs of publicly funded medications topic. So the first step is, of course, to work to understand your funders' priorities. And again, some of these are easier to identify because they might be publicly known priorities of certain political parties or organizations. And others are going to require more active needs assessment work to identify them by meeting with your funders, reading their priority reports, reviewing their budgets, that sort of thing. In Ontario, we actually received funding under our Liberal government, and since then elected a Conservative government. So we've actually had to tailor quite a bit the positioning of our topics accordingly, while always still making sure that the topics that we choose are informed by the challenges that our providers are facing. So again, there's a difference between choosing benzodiazepine use in older adults as a topic and then presenting it to our funders as a cost savings or patient safety topic.
Are we ready for a poll here?
Yeah, I just want to give a little bit of a background. We just have a few questions throughout our presentation just to get you guys all thinking about how these strategies can be applied to your own services. So Bevan, yeah, if you want to take it away with the first one.
All right. So what are your funders' current priorities? If you don't have current priorities coming directly from a funder, you can sort of share what you think a funder who would support your program might want to prioritize. All right, opioids, ending the opioid overdose, suicide prevention, opioid safety. Also metrics, do funders have specific things they want to see go up or down? If folks have that, they can share. So reducing opioid prescribing, getting X waivered, patient safety, HIV prevention, lots of opioid safety, fewer prescriptions. So does this kind of seem like a sort of cross-section you would expect to see, Victoria? And cost savings as well?
Yeah, so one thing that we really wanted to point out was that a lot of the times the priorities of the funder may not align well with the priorities of the providers that you're serving. So we see a lot of opioid safety, cost savings, things like that, and those two things don't really go well together. Oftentimes, or things like HIV PrEP and like cancer screening, things like that, they don't really go together, and that those things are actually causing topics perhaps in the short term. So you kind of have to think about how you're positioning, if cost savings is a priority, that you're positioning those topics in a way that will show cost savings.
Okay. So the third strategy we wanted to share was around fostering relationships with key stakeholders to be able to amplify your service's presence among decision makers. So I'm sure this suggestion is nothing new, but the key here that we really wanted to emphasize was once we've actually identified the stakeholders, engaging them in the aspect of your service that's going to be the most meaningful to their organizational mission to get that deep-rooted buy-in. So I'll give you an example. With our local researchers and implementation scientists, of course, their mission is to investigate on and publish the various healthcare interventions that are being present or being delivered in the sector. So we in Ontario engage them in the design of our evaluations and the conducting of them, so that down the road, they're more willing to publish on and share our results from our service, because of course that having that third party support really helps to build the credibility of your service.
Moving to the next slide.
Okay, so the next two strategies are related to working to embed your service into the network of your healthcare sector. So it becomes seen as an indispensable aspect of it. So the first part of this is embedding at the system level through working with other initiatives to deliver integrated supports to providers. So for this, for us, it's actually required like learning what those other initiatives are that are being offered to our target audience, which can include audience feedback, mentoring, digital health supports, and then working with those who actually deliver those other initiatives to align the messaging between our two programs and actually refer providers between them. So this really enables us to provide a seamless support experience as much as possible to the provider who might otherwise feel a little bit overwhelmed by the number of supports being offered to them. And it also, of course, works to embed your service into the network of the healthcare system, helping your service be seen as an indispensable aspect of it.
All right, looks like we have another poll here. Victoria and Lindsay want to know what stakeholders and or initiatives could you collaborate with from your jurisdiction? And those of you who have already done that, let us know, who have you collaborated with in terms of stakeholders or other initiatives in your community? We'll see what comes up. All right, public health is a great place to start. I know we have a lot of public health folks on the call who joined us. The state tobacco line, again, Department of Public Health. Health systems, insurance companies, wonderful, wonderful. More Department of Public Health, tribal entities, CME providers, CMOs, hospital systems, wonderful, more insurance companies, quality improvement organizations. It looks like specific provider academies, lots of great stuff. And I'm sure there are others that folks are connecting with based on what their clinical topic might be. All right, back to you, Lindsay and Victoria. And we have medical societies. That's always a good one, and associations here in the States. I know folks connect with those quite a bit, and coalitions. Back to you two.
Yeah, medical societies is a great one that we in Ontario, we engage them in the content development component of our service to really get their buy-in when we're actually developing and like scoping out a topic, so that, you know, down the road they're willing to promote that to their members. So that's a good one. We definitely use that one here in Ontario. Okay, so then the other part of the strategy relating to embedding your service into the healthcare network is embedding at the practice level by adapting the visit approach. So providers, or adapting it to providers depending on what practice model they work in. So things that we're starting to think about here in Ontario are what other healthcare providers work in those practices who might need to receive a visit, or maybe just the visit material, and how could that material be adapted to those providers? Or could those other providers partner with our detailers to actually deliver the visits? Or could those other providers be trained to become academic detailers within their own teams as well? And then the other thing thinking about is, do those practices have any care or clinical pathways that are relevant to the topic that you're detailing on? So just being prepared for those practice differences have helped us really make the most of the time that we have with providers, but again, help detailers embed themselves within the network of that practice so they become seen as an essential aspect of it.
So the last strategy that we wanted to share, which is one that we've been developing just over this past year, is around having the flexibility to modify your usual processes to meet the emerging needs of providers, stakeholders, or funders. So what we mean by this is having alternative ways of going about your usual operations so that you can lean on these alternatives when needed. So times like when you're on a tight timeline or when you're asked to tackle a topic that is maybe outside of your normal realm. So to elaborate on this, I wanted to circle back on how we were asked to pivot for COVID-19 and narrow in on how this forced us to modify our usual processes. Just back one slide, Devin. Thank you. So the first is around our content development and detailer upskilling. So our usual content development and upskilling process takes about 6 months and is very structured. We only had a few weeks to get up and running with this topic, so the timelines really had to be condensed quite a bit. And in order to make this work, we developed a base for the tool and training material, and then we continuously updated and added to the tool as new evidence and guidance emerged. Knowing we'd need to do this, we developed the tool in HTML format so that it could be a sort of living document on our website. And we also held ongoing weekly webinars to keep the detailers up to date on any recent changes. In addition to condensing our timelines, a lot of our operations had to go virtual, including both training and the visits themselves. Like many of you, we decided to use Zoom as our main platform. So to make sure that this transition was as seamless as possible, we started using Zoom for regular meetings in addition to training webinars. And we also encouraged the detailers to practice and become comfortable with Zoom's features so that their focus during visits could really be on the conversations that they're having with physicians. In-person recruitment was also impossible due to COVID-19, so our detailers really had to rely solely on cold calling and emailing. So with this comes the risk that you're going to lose physicians before they actually get to the point of scheduling a visit. So to reduce this risk, we employed an online booking system that allowed physicians to book directly in their detailer's calendar. And then lastly, the typical role of our detailers was really challenged for this topic. So to play to our detailers' training and expertise, we would normally tackle pharmacotherapy-based topics that have a strong evidence base. But for our COVID-19 topic, it focused on managing primary care as a whole during the pandemic. And there was a lack of well-established evidence, which was evolving daily. So with such a large and ever-expanding scope, it was impossible for our detailers to become experts on the entire topic. So each detailer became an expert in a component of the topic and supported each other in becoming comfortable with that information. Next slide. So we plan on maintaining some of these changes that we've made to our processes to ensure flexibility going forward. For example, when we're able to go back to in-person visits eventually, we only have the capacity to visit physicians that are in certain regions of Ontario, as you can see in the map on the screen there, as that's where our detailers are located. However, we're going to continue offering these virtual visits for physicians outside of these regions to allow for a broader reach and higher uptake, and continue using this booking system to schedule visits efficiently. And then we also plan on developing more of our tools in HTML format, which will give physicians much easier access to up-to-date information. If you're interested in seeing what this kind of looks like, I encourage you to take a look at our COVID-19 Resource Center, for which the URL is on the screen there, and maybe we can share it in the chat as well.
Absolutely. Yep, everyone, it's cep.health/COVID-19. And Winnie was kind enough to get that set up and already ready to go. All right.
Perfect. Thank you. So for us, having a sustainable program requires implementing various strategies that allow for our service to be viewed as a solution to a wide range of primary care challenges and to have a large presence and value in the primary care landscape of Ontario. As we've learned from COVID-19, part of this is having the flexibility to pivot and modify our processes, whether that's in the face of a pandemic or simply just to meet emerging needs. Our hope is that by listening to the strategies that we've implemented, you got an idea or two for how you can develop and implement some strategies in your programs to support their sustainability. And that said, I believe we have one final question for you.
Sure do. All right. What strategy could you implement to support the sustainability of your service/program? And ladies, do you mean during a time like COVID, or do you mean in general? Either? Both?
Both.
Both. All right.
Yeah.
What's a strategy for sustainability? All right. Enterprise mindset, bake sales. Love it. Love it. Love it. Being flexible. Rob a bank. Be a solution. Legally mandate AD. Yes. All right. Adaptability. Lots of adaptability here. I like that people are thinking outside the box with both legal and illegal things. Partnering with other organizations. I'm sure that's something that Lindsay and Victoria are nodding emphatically about. Yes. Promoting a value-based payment model. Being ready and expecting to pivot. Assessing needs. So it looks like we've got a lot of people saying just be ready to adapt. And somebody wrote, the perfect is the enemy of the good. I'm going to guess that might be Mike. And yeah, this is all good stuff. I'm all down with the legally mandate AD and the bake sales. What do you think, Victoria and Lindsay?
I completely agree. Never thought of the bake sales idea, but we'll definitely bring that back to the team.
Wonderful. Well, we'll take a pause here to say thank you so much and to tee some questions to both of you from the chat box. From our very own Brenda Schuster, one of our training facilitators and also a fellow Canadian, she'd like to know how much prodding was required to have a successful online physician-led booking system. Did you need to follow up a lot to get the booking, and did it seem to save time in the end? What are your thoughts about that?
So from our perspective, we don't use the TimeTap booking system ourselves. It's really the detailers that are, emailing their physicians and asking them to use that system. They're always giving the option to either use the TimeTap link that they provide. They each have their own booking website, so they have personal links that they can send to their physicians. So they always give that option, or that the physician can just email with them if that's what they're more comfortable with. I believe Nicole, who is one of our detailers, put a comment in the chat.
Yep, she's sharing that you all use TimeTap and that it saves a ton of time. So that's great to know. It says that 75 to 80% of physicians have successfully used it. So TimeTap that, people. We have time for one more question before we pivot over to Australia. Thank you guys so much. We always love the fact that you work so well together, and CEP is such a great organization. Please check out their website. They've got a lot of really great, clear and sharp communications to really get across the point of what is available to physicians, primary care physicians in their region, and are definitely the group to watch and emulate. All right. Thank you, ladies, so much. We really appreciate it. If you have any more questions for Lindsay and Victoria, please pop them in the chat or email us at narcad@partners.org. Thank you both so much. Really appreciate it. All right. We are going to switch gears and go all the way over to Australia. Deb, I'm going to ask you, since I haven't done the math yet, what time is it in your world right now?
Well, it's actually quite civilized now. It's 6 a.m. in the morning, but I've been getting up at 2 a.m. each morning because the conference has been amazing and it's been energizing me for the whole day. So I just wanted to firstly thank Jerry for academic detailing, because it's been a wonderful career and it's certainly changed my life, Jerry. And to Mike, it's been great to connect with you and to learn from you and with you. And what an awesome team in Anna and Bevan and Winnie. It's been amazing to get to meet you, and it has been a fantastic conference. So yeah, it's been well worth it.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you so much. And I'd love to steal your comment for our conference testimonials line. I got up at 2 in the morning just to join. If that doesn't make people want to come next year, I don't know what will. All right. Thank you so much. And back over to you.
Thank you very much. I've had the privilege to be involved in academic detailing for a very long time, and certainly have had the privilege to be involved in designing, delivering, evaluating academic detailing programs to family care physicians, specialists, but also in nursing homes, and also working with our pharmacy undergraduates and postgraduates. I don't have any conflicts of interest to declare, but this paper that I'm going to present today is around a study that we had funding from our state South Australian government and also from the National Heart Foundation. Thank you. So academic detailing really needs no introduction to this audience. We've talked already a bit about it being one-to-one visiting, and a couple of points I'm going to highlight is, it's undertaken in the recipient's own practice setting, and the timing is at the convenience of that person. And one of the things I really try and emphasize is it's as close to real-time decision-making. It's where the doctors that we visit or the nurses are making those clinical decisions. And another key element is that there are a priori key messages which are developed that are succinct and directly relevant to patient care. But as Jerry and others throughout this conference have highlighted, it's also about the robustness of the evidence and staying connected to the evidence. So I think the, one of the other parts, and other presenters have highlighted this as well, from the training in academic detailing, the communication is using a structured framework. We're trying to identify and meet the needs of the person that we're visiting and interacting with. And we want to understand their motivations for current practice. The really important thing, I think, is that it's about communication. It's not just about the information. We want it to be the best available evidence, but we want to move people from their existing behaviour and addressing the barriers to what that current behaviour might be. And again, many presenters have highlighted we're trying to identify needs, how we do that. And there is some overlap with some other behaviour change techniques, but certainly it's focusing on encouraging voluntary action. It's not about coercion or enforcement. The academic detailing, really is about bringing the best available evidence to that point where decisions are made, and tailoring it to the individual, whether it is a doctor, a nurse, a pharmacist, whoever it is that we are interacting with. And it draws on the principles of social marketing, adult learning, social cognitive theory, trans-theoretical model of behaviours of change, diffusion of innovation. So there's a theoretical underpinning for this work that we're doing. And it really is focusing on the interests of the person as the first priority. And I hope that then this leads us straight into patient-centered care. So those first few slides were, to highlight what you already know. This is an academic detailing community. You know that really well. But I wanted you to now come into thinking about patient-centered care. Mary Liz highlighted this morning that the health system is changing from when academic detailing, those first studies were published. And our health system and many health systems in the world are shifting to a value-based, patient-centered. And if we look at here, those principles of patient-centered care, it is about empowering them to contribute to their own healthcare, ensuring that they have, that we value their choices and we listen to them. And so if we then think about patients' education, that's just the next slide, thanks. Patient education is often provided in an opportunistic, ad hoc, and perhaps time-constrained way. It's often very transactional, not relationship-based, and many clinicians don't have training in educational theory and behaviour change methods. Many patients also have ready access to information from social media and the internet. Much of the information assumes a level of literacy and numeracy, and the patient education may involve information only. It might involve counselling, and there are many issues surrounding clinicians' responsibility, and that I suppose that balance between patient autonomy and the clinician's role to promote the well-being of their patient. We've also, across this conference, touched on motivational interviewing and also how we might use those techniques to identify needs when we're undertaking academic detailing. And certainly in patient education, motivational interviewing techniques are widely used to encourage behaviour change. And I'm not going to go into that in detail, but just really to highlight that patient-centred education is something that as an experienced academic detailer, we've often been providing patient resources and tools for the physician that we're interacting with. It became something that we were thinking that over these 35 years, academic detailing continues to evolve. There's ongoing research. So perhaps thinking about patient-centred education based on the structure of an academic detailing visit. Thank you. So, you know, when you look at perhaps the context, the exchange and the commitment as our structure for a patient-centred structured educational visit, we call that PCSEV. I know this is meant to be an acronym-free zone, but most often it tends to be an ARA, an acronym-rich area. Sorry, Bevan. And so just breaking that down into you know, thinking about what might be some of the subcategories. And those of you experienced in academic detailing will see how many of those those domains and subcategories resonate with the principles of academic detailing. And again, in the interest of time, I might move on then to, so taking that and thinking about a new frontier using the principles of academic detailing. You know, and so, you know, to sit back and dream about academic detailing and to think about how we might design and build and develop our materials based on those principles. So working with Professor Prash Sanders, who was the lead for this project, he is a cardiologist, and we were looking at atrial fibrillation and looking at the burden of AF, which is increasing. And as you can see in this graphic, it is now the most common cardiovascular cause of hospitalisation with very significant costs in the US. Thank you, Bevan. So we thought, well, we could apply the principles of academic detailing to this patient-centred structured educational visit, so we designed a program using a home-based intervention. Now, we used a home-based intervention because to stay true to the principles of academic detailing, where we deliver that as close to real time in the recipient's own setting. And just as we would visit with the physicians in their practice, we thought, well, we'll design this around a home-based intervention and with a goal to result in reduced hospitalisations and improved quality of life. We designed key messages based on the evidence. We developed our resources, again, upholding the principles of academic detailing, those concise educational resources, graphically attractive to engage with the patients that we were visiting in their homes. We had these a priori key messages developed. Thank you. And we designed a randomised control trial. Now, I really liked what Harold said. Just because you could, we did that too. We also were fortunate to receive funding, as I said, from the government and from the Heart Foundation. So we set up a randomised controlled trial. As I said, Professor Prash Sanders was the lead investigator. And we enrolled 627 patients, and we had a usual care control. And 2 home visits by a nurse or a pharmacist who were trained in the principles of academic detailing. We used a 3-day workshop to do that. And across the period of the study, we used mentoring and coaching to ensure the fidelity and the maintenance of the principles of academic detailing and the method, so we could learn with and from them as well. So our outcomes. This is just really just to highlight that having undertaken this RCT, where the primary outcome was to look at hospitalizations. And in the HELP AF study, compared to usual care, we followed patients for 2 years after the intervention. Next slide, please. And so a home-based structured patient-centered education program underpinned by the principles of academic detailing. We reduced unplanned hospitalizations. So this was total by 26%, AF related by 31%, and other cardiac by 49%. It resulted in some improvements in AF in specific quality of life symptoms, but not in the general health-related quality of life measures. Thank you. So personalisation of patient education, taking into account the context, the connection, conversation and commitment. We raised our eyes to look over the bench and see perhaps a different horizon. Thank you. And we have then looked at these key aspects of a patient-centered structured educational visit based on the principles of academic detailing. And I've elaborated there on some of the key components, such as it was delivered in the home environment. So and the connection, also the commitment, empowering patients to undertake self-care and agree on behavioural goals. Thank you. So the AD principles applied, assessing the patient's prior knowledge and motivations, just as you would do in other academic detailing interventions, but also focusing on a limited number of evidence-based key messages. And I see this as one of the perhaps differences between motivational interviewing, acknowledging the overlap with motivational interviewing, and those of you who are on participating in this conference may have a lot of expertise in that area, using the graphical educational materials, and I think, you know, tailoring it to the individual's understanding. Thank you. And so in this COVID era, we've talked about this across the conference that, yes, undertaking these visits in the patient's own home required quite considerable logistics. And maybe we could now extend our study to look at perhaps undertaking some virtual visits with patients in their own home. The patients really valued the fact that we valued them enough to come and have a relationship-based education session where we would spend that time with them and then follow up in 6 to 8 weeks after the first visit to see how they were going. So not all patients will welcome health professionals into their home. It made the local paper here in South Australia where the patients felt empowered and encouraged to undertake the REST plan. And we chose the REST plan rather than an action plan because it was what they could do themselves. Thank you, Bevan. I would just like to acknowledge the study group and trial investigators. It certainly was a team effort. And when we set up the study, we made sure that we had a data safety monitoring board because we do see that education is a powerful intervention. And like other studies, it warrants that level of rigor and monitoring. It was a multi-site study conducted over a number of years. So we wanted to make sure that we had those safety net set up as part of the study. So next slide, thanks.
All right. Well, Deb, I'm going to take, I was going to say, I'm going to pop back to this and just say, this image is the jam, right? For all of us who are doing this work and we want to know where is it going, like this moment feels particularly impactful. So thank you so much for, you know, sharing with us this approach of taking the AD approach and really, you know, applying it to a patient-centered perspective. It's beautiful work. And again, moments like this where an image is captured in such a profound way really does speak 1,000 words. We have time for a couple quick questions from Deborah, and similarly to yesterday, we're actually going to ask the 3 groups who were presenting on the global panel just now if they'd be kind enough to stick around during the break and answer any questions in the chat box that we didn't get to. But I know people have questions and reflections for Deborah. Jerry, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot, I know you always have a lot to say and have known Deborah for quite some time. So any reflections to kick us off while we're waiting for the chat box to populate, please do kick us off.
Thank you very much. I was actually about to put something in the chat box, but I'm even happier to thank Deb in person, as it were, for a really, really great presentation. Deb, is this getting written up somewhere where we can all read about it in some medical journal?
Yes, it certainly is, and I'm sharing some of the results in advance of the work. We've certainly published the methods paper, and we've also published a paper on the educational resources that have been developed. It was one of the things, Jerry, so they've already been published, but it was interesting for us as academic detailers. We understand this concept of a structured educational visit. It was a reminder to me, and I've shared this with Mike and with Zach, is that to others, they thought, oh, structured, we could just use the resource. That's all we need. We just hand out the brochure as such. We want them to understand the whole package.
I think it is so great that you're applying this to helping educate patients as well. And it really is moving the field in a very important additional direction. And I appreciated your distinction between motivational interviewing, which is great and has many overlaps, as you mentioned, but the academic detailing approach also having its own attributes, which you're using so beautifully. And my very last comment was I couldn't help but notice that your work is being supported by the Australian government to help empower patients in the same month that our federal government is in the court trying to take away health insurance from the masses of our population. So it's a slightly different, I guess it's a country-specific difference, but it's great that you're getting that level of support, and thank you for this really great work.
And thank you very much.
Deb. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being so patient with us here at NaRCAD and moving some things around behind the scenes. We're 60 seconds over for your break, but hopefully not too much. Come on back to us at 3 o'clock. If you have questions for Deb, Victoria, Lindsay, or Harold, do pop them into the chat box. Someone at NaRCAD will help moderate, or you can have private messages directly with each other. At 3 o'clock, we're going to have our awesome 2020 yearbook and wrap up. Please stick around for the wrap up. It's totally worth it and a lot of fun. And thank you again to our fantastic Global Perspectives panel. We appreciate you. We'll see you back in 15. Thank you.
The theme, I think when you say we'll just put the resources out there and patients will take advantage of it, to me, that's really likely to, if not perpetuate, at least not address any kind of underlying healthcare disparities in terms of patients' socioeconomic status, literacy, health literacy, education level. You know, when we, you know, there's a great, so many of the health apps that you see out there on your app store or whatever are great for someone with a college or higher education who's health seeking already, who's looking for an app to use. And that's fine. It's a nice consumer product, the same way good running shoes are a nice consumer product. But if you really want to sort of make a population difference, I think to your point, you're not just putting the resource there passively for people who know how to get it, but trying to engage with patients and say, okay, where are your barriers? How can I help you? And it's that personalization that lets you hopefully engage with that patient's barriers. I mean, that's why I think this is, you know, this is so interesting.
Thank you very much. Because I know there's some other, when he was just highlighting, Harold, you're there too as well. And the other,
yeah,
Lindsay,
no, I think we have all the presenters from the whole afternoon session. Actually, I'd be curious going back if any of the HIV presenters, Dawn or any of the others, wanted to speak to whether whether there's anything to think about in terms of connecting with patients, either those who are candidates for PrEP or maybe patients who might be IART to engage with them. I mean, I know a lot of, you know, we focus, because we're academic detailers, traditionally focus on getting clinicians up to speed. And Dawn was talking about how primary care doctors can learn about PrEP and other interventions. But I wonder if any of the principles you're talking about could apply to something like PrEP, where the engagement, the information, and the patient commitment to stay on treatment are so important for it to be successful.
Yes, we also have a question from Jackie Travers for Deb in the chat. So Deb.
Okay, Dawn, I don't know if you had a reaction to that. If you didn't, then we'll just jump to the next question.
Yeah, Dawn, I can go.
What was the question?
Oh, I was just asking whether any of this kind of detailing principles applied to patients. I was reflecting on how it might have resonance for patients who are PrEP eligible or even IART eligible, where the getting patients engaged and committed, it's the same kind of thing. We have some patients who are seeking out PrEP, who have a lot of health literacy, are really well informed, are coming to teach their PCPs about PrEP. But we have a lot of patients who are PrEP eligible who maybe don't have that information right at their fingertips, and it's something like what Deborah's talking about, a way we could connect with those patients more effectively and help engage them in getting on PrEP and staying on PrEP in a way that could really benefit them.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big unresolved issues in PrEP care is engaging patients in more than just the cursory, here's some pills, start it. And keeping, sort of keeping them engaged in the process. This is going to be even more important as there's a new PrEP modality that's coming online, which involves giving an injection every 2 months instead of a pill every day. And again, helping patients to understand what the pros and cons of different methods are and which one is right for them. And if they want to change their mind at some point, how they would switch. It's going to require a level of communication between patients and providers that we haven't figured out yet.
Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity. Sorry, Deborah, go ahead.
No, I thank you, Dawn, very much, because you highlight very much what I see. A lot of education is around transactional. It's like getting it done, giving the information, whereas academic detailing is relationship-based at its core. And I think it also values the patient. We value the physician. That's, we listen to them, we want to learn from them. And I think the same principles apply with the patient. Is we want to listen to them and understand their story, so we can be of value to them. I know that when I was talking with Winnie, I see at our program, it's about turning facts into value, and it's the same for the patients. It's turning those facts into value for them.
Absolutely. Well, I don't want to monopolize. Can someone who's has the power to do it unmute Jackie for her question? Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, I was just kind of thinking that I see quite a bit of similarity with medication therapy management that tends to be led by pharmacists here. Just wondering where you see kind of overlap in those two pieces possibly working together.
I do see that these principles are very similar, but again, I think it's a continuum in that sometimes pharmacists also take that, in terms of getting that message across, and right through to, very similar using this approach. It's what we teach in the undergraduate program, and also in our postgraduate masters, is trying to get them to think about that framework of communication, very similar to, the introduction, identifying needs, establishing trust and credibility, overcoming objections, closing, like helping them to understand that as a method. But we see that as more interprofessional or professional communication, rather than giving it the label of academic detailing, because academic detailing has got those other principles and rigor that needs to be applied. I don't know if that answers, Jackie.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
And then I see a question for Lindsay and Victoria asking, and you're trying to clarify, and I don't know, Teresa, if you can clarify, yes, if CEP produced AN
these specific materials.
Hi there. Lindsay, you were wondering what ANNA meant. It looks like Alaska Native and Native American populations. Do you know whether or not CEP's production of materials was ANNA specific? Oh, sorry, I need to unmute you now. Pardon me.
Thank
we
you.
took away everyone's privileges.
That's okay. Thanks, Teresa. We actually haven't done any material specific to those populations in Canada, although with our COVID topic and with our latest topic around type 2 diabetes, we have tried to include as much as possible. Specifically within Canada, like we have special coverages for populations. We've tried to make sure that's in all of our materials. But no, we haven't done anything specific to that population. We would love to do that in the future, specifically around our type 2 diabetes topic.
Well, I'm just gonna take a minute or so to help our 2020 presenters do their audio check. Anna and Chris, can you both speak?
Hi, Winnie.
All right, I hear Anna, I see Anna. Where's Chris?
Do we have Chris Shea here with us?
Yes, he is. He's here. Chris?
Oh, great.
I'm here.
All right, perfect. All right, Kelsey.
All right, are you hearing me now?
Yes.
Beautifully.
Okay, wonderful.
Okay. Kelsey.
Hi.
Where's Kelsey? Where's Kelsey? I
hear me?
Okay, yep. I love the background. And Vishal.
Good afternoon.
Perfect. Okay, I'm going to keep Kelsey and Vishal muted until their turn. Anna and Chris, you'll be presenting shortly.
Very good.
All right, this is almost 60 seconds before we're going to kick off. I'm going to pull back up our slide deck. All right, and it sounds like somebody has some sounds coming on. So let's see if we can mute everyone. I think it was Chris, so I muted you, Chris. Apologies. But I do like your clock sound. All right. And we're just getting settled here on the NaRCAD end of things, so give us 1 second. Okay.